Mike Sisko and Karen Harkness were found murdered in their bed, a place where they should have felt safest. There were no signs of forced entry, robbery, or a struggle. From the start, investigators believed the crime was personal and targeted. As they investigated Mike and Karen's lives, a disturbing truth emerged. The killer was not a stranger, but someone connected to their past. Despite this, the case became a decades-long struggle for justice. A conviction was overturned, and a persistent question remained: if the killer was so obvious, why was it so difficult to prove their guilt? The silence in the house felt unsettling. It was Sunday, July 7, 2002, in Topeka, Kansas. Plans were in place, and people were expected to arrive. Phone calls should have been answered. But something was amiss, causing concern to grow. When Karen Harkness's parents arrived, they were unprepared for what they found. In a basement bedroom, Karen Harkness and Mike Sisko were dead in bed, both shot multiple times. The violence was focused, intentional, and extreme. Court records showed each victim had numerous gunshot wounds, far more than necessary to kill. This indicated a clear intent to kill. The room offered clues, but not the whole picture. There were no signs of forced entry, like broken doors or windows, suggesting a calm entry. Karen still wore her jewelry, and her purse was untouched. Mike's wallet, cash, and checks were also untouched. Robbery seemed unlikely. The scene appeared deliberate, not random or rushed. Investigators quickly realized the implications. The attack occurred while the victims were likely asleep or unaware. There were no signs of a struggle or resistance. The shooter either surprised them or entered without raising alarm. This detail narrowed the possibilities. Such intense, personal violence rarely happens without a history. Mike Sisko and Karen Harkness were partners, both divorced and navigating complex family situations. Those who knew them said they were trying to build a stable life together. However, stability can be fragile. Detectives immediately looked inward, toward relationships, past conflicts, and anyone who might have felt anger, resentment, or loss. There was no immediate suspect, confession, or single piece of evidence to solve the case. Instead, they had a pattern: 2 people, 1 room, multiple gunshots, no theft, no forced entry, no randomness. A targeted killing. Every targeted killing has a history that predates the violence. Investigators now had to uncover that history, layer by layer, relationship by relationship, to understand the silence in the house. Something had been building in Mike Sisko and Karen Harkness's past. Whatever it was, it had reached a breaking point. Before the violence, they were building a life. Mike and Karen were not young, but adults who had experienced disappointment. Both had been married before and carried the weight of divorce and failed relationships. However, in the years leading up to 2002, they found each other and the possibility of a more stable future. They were creating a life together in Topeka. Friends and family described their relationship as committed, practical, and forward-looking. It wasn't impulsive love, but a carefully constructed partnership. They shared routines, made plans, and managed children, responsibilities, and past relationships. It was, in many ways, a second chance at stability. Karen Harkness was a reliable and stable person who had strong family ties, particularly with her parents. Her life was well organized and routine, so any changes in her behavior were easily noticeable. Mike Sisko's past was complicated by his divorce from Dana Chandler. Although the marriage was legally over, their emotional connection remained tense. Testimony and records show their relationship was strained, filled with disputes and disagreements about family matters, especially their children. Divorce didn't end the conflict. The tension lingered. People who knew them described a strained atmosphere. Small incidents hinted at unresolved resentment. Mike and Karen reportedly felt watched, harassed, or unsettled by interactions related to Mike's past. These claims became central to the prosecution's theory, while others were disputed. What mattered was not just what was proven, but what Mike and Karen feared. Fear changes behavior, impacting routines and reactions. Investigators wondered if Mike and Karen sensed something building around them, something unseen but present. Despite this, life went on. There were no obvious signs of imminent danger, no police intervention, and no clear escalation before July 7, 2002. Any warning signs were subtle, any threat was hidden. This makes the case disturbing. On the surface, Mike and Karen seemed to be moving forward. But investigators suspected a darker current beneath, fueled by anger, proximity, and someone who couldn't accept Mike's new life. Detectives realized understanding Mike and Karen meant understanding who was close to them and their new beginning. Sometimes, the most dangerous person is not a stranger, but someone already known. The investigation found a pattern before it found a suspect. Detectives often start by looking at who had access, history, and motive. As they investigated Mike and Karen's lives, one relationship kept resurfacing: Mike's ex-wife, Dana Chandler. The divorce was legal, but the emotional separation was incomplete. Their shared children, history, and unresolved conflict kept them connected, and the conflict seemed to worsen. Witnesses described hostile interactions. Dana allegedly expressed anger toward Mike and Karen. Some accounts described intrusive behavior, calls, presence, and actions that seemed explainable individually but formed an unsettling pattern. Not every allegation was confirmed, but investigators examined patterns, even if they are uncomfortable. The pattern suggested emotional escalation. Testimony suggested Mike and Karen felt pressure from outside their relationship. It wasn't constant or always visible, but it was noticeable and remembered later. Motive takes shape through accumulation, not a single event. Jealousy, resentment, loss, and the belief that something was taken away and replaced. In domestic homicides, these emotions often deepen and distort, sometimes becoming fixations. However, suspicion is not proof. Initially, investigators lacked direct physical evidence linking anyone to the crime scene. They had no murder weapon that immediately solved the case and no eyewitness who could identify a suspect inside the house during the killings. Instead, they relied on behavioral context, which could guide the investigation but not solve it. Nevertheless, their focus began to narrow. Detectives examined timelines, tracking people's locations and verifying their alibis. They investigated who had the ability to travel, enter the house, and act discreetly. They scrutinized phone records, personal histories, and past conflicts. Every detail was important because, without clear forensic evidence, the truth often lies in consistency or its absence. As the investigation progressed, one question became essential: if this was a targeted killing, who had both the motive and the determination to commit it? Investigators believed the answer was connected to the victims' lives. However, proving this suspicion would take years. While the picture surrounding the couple was becoming clearer, the path to certainty was not. The crime scene presented both clarity and confusion. From the start, investigators were sure the killings were intentional due to the excessive number of gunshot wounds on both Mike Sisko and Karen Harkness. This was not a crime of panic but an act of overkill, where violence exceeds its purpose and reflects strong emotion. However, emotion doesn't leave physical traces. Inside the house, there were no clear signs of forced entry. The doors and windows were intact, suggesting the killer either had permission to enter or found a way in without causing a disturbance. Even more significant was what hadn't been taken. Valuables, jewelry, wallets, cash, and personal belongings were untouched. Unlike many homicide cases where theft complicates the motive, its absence here simplified it. This wasn't about money or opportunity, it was personal. Despite this clarity, the physical evidence didn't immediately identify a suspect. There was no publicly confirmed DNA match early on. No recovered weapon could be definitively linked to anyone. Ballistics could only determine the type of firearm used, not who fired it. The scene seemed deliberately controlled, revealing very little forensic information. This created a problem. Without strong physical evidence, the case depended heavily on reconstructing events through timelines, behavior analysis, and identifying inconsistencies. Investigators had to build a narrative from small pieces of information, each of which had to be thoroughly examined. They began by examining the victim's last hours. When were Mike and Karen last seen alive? Who spoke to them? Were there any unusual calls, messages, or movements? In cases like this, even minor discrepancies can be crucial, such as a missed call, a delayed response, or an unusually early silence. Next, they considered the issue of access. Who knew the layout of the house? Who knew the basement bedroom was occupied? Who could enter without raising suspicion? These questions served as filters, narrowing the list of potential suspects. Investigators also explored whether the scene was staged to mislead them. Could the lack of forced entry be deceptive? While these questions didn't immediately lead to breakthroughs, they guided the investigation. However, weeks turned into months, and months into years. The absence of conclusive forensic evidence slowed the investigation, requiring careful and often frustratingly slow progress. Leads were tested, retested, and frequently discarded. Suspicions arose, but without supporting evidence, they were not enough. Yet one thing remained constant: the nature of the crime. 2 victims. Multiple gunshot wounds. No theft. No forced entry. A targeted act. This type of crime almost always leaves a trace, not necessarily in physical evidence, but in behavior, history, and the relationships surrounding the victims. Investigators realized the crime scene wasn't providing answers, so they had to look elsewhere: people and their memories. They focused on subtle inconsistencies that arose when stories were retold, believing someone knew the truth. The case wasn't solved with one breakthrough. It was carefully constructed. Without direct forensic evidence linking a suspect to the scene, investigators focused on reconstructing events, movements, behaviors, statements, and patterns. They believed piecing these together would reveal intent. This process was slow, relying on accumulated details rather than a single discovery. Dana Chandler remained central to the investigation. According to records and testimony, detectives built a timeline of her movements before and after the murders. They looked at her whereabouts, who could confirm them, and what couldn't be verified. Travel became crucial. Distance, opportunity, and timing had to align. Witnesses were interviewed repeatedly. Some described past tensions between Dana and Mike. Others recalled statements or behavior that seemed more significant in retrospect. Some accounts suggested hostility toward Karen Hartness, but details varied and weren't always verifiable. Investigators looked for consistent overlaps and repeated themes in multiple accounts. Then came the behavioral evidence. Prosecutors argued that Dana Chandler's actions after the murders were relevant. Her public statements, interactions, and insistence on innocence didn't prove guilt, but in a circumstantial case, behavior could suggest her state of mind. The challenge was convincing a jury. There was no confession, no eyewitness, and no single piece of conclusive physical evidence. Prosecutors would present a collection of details suggesting motive, opportunity, and intent. These details included claims that Dana had expressed anger over Mike's relationship with Karen, struggled to accept his new life, and that the tension had escalated. But motive alone wasn't enough. Investigators needed to show how the crime could have happened. They examined travel routes, time frames, access to weapons, and familiarity with the house, seeking any indication that Dana could have entered and left undetected. The case gradually took shape. It wasn't a straightforward narrative, but a structure, fragile in places, disputed in others, but ultimately strong enough for prosecutors to believe it could hold up in court. Years passed before charges were filed. The case moved from investigation to trial, where every detail would be scrutinized and presented to a jury. Building a case is one thing. Proving it beyond a reasonable doubt is another. The trial would reveal both the strengths and weaknesses of the evidence. A decade after the murders, the case went to court. In 2012, Dana Chandler was tried for the murders of Mike Sisko and Karen Hartness. The prosecution presented years of investigative work as a coherent story, a targeted killing driven by personal motive, and Dana Chandler had both the reason and the opportunity. The case wasn't built on direct physical evidence. Prosecutors relied on circumstantial evidence, testimony about past conflicts, statements attributed to Chandler, and interpretations of her behavior before and after the murders. They argued that emotional motive, combined with access and timing, explained the crime. The defense team fought back in court. They argued that the witnesses weren't trustworthy and pointed out the lack of solid forensic evidence. They stressed that no weapon was definitively linked to Dana Chandler. They claimed the case was built on suspicion, not actual proof, and that the holes in the prosecution's argument were too significant to ignore. Despite these efforts, the jury found Chandler guilty. Dana Chandler was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. This verdict seemed to bring closure, providing an answer and a name associated with the crime after 10 years. Many believed justice had finally been served. However, this resolution was short-lived. Over the following years, the case fell apart. Chandler appealed her conviction, claiming the trial was unfair. Her appeal focused on prosecutorial misconduct, alleging that the prosecution made inappropriate statements that influenced the jury beyond what was legally permissible. In 2018, the Kansas Supreme Court made its ruling. The conviction was overturned. The court determined that the prosecution's actions had undermined the trial's fairness. This wasn't necessarily due to false evidence, but because the prosecution presented arguments in a way that could have misled or unfairly influenced the jury. In a legal system that demands strict fairness, this distinction is crucial. The outcome was immediate and significant. The guilty verdict was thrown out, and the case was sent back to the lower court. The legal conclusion that had stood for years was erased, not because the facts of the crime had changed, but because the trial process itself didn't meet the required standards. For the victims' families, the ordeal reopened old wounds. For the investigators, the case was once again uncertain. For Dana Chandler, her presumption of innocence was restored, meaning she would face a new trial. The initial sense of resolution was gone. As the case headed back to court, a key question emerged: could the evidence, deemed insufficient in the first trial, stand up in a second? The case was back in court, but this time, the outcome was uncertain. After the 2018 reversal, prosecutors decided to retry Dana Chandler, despite the evidence remaining largely the same. There was still no direct forensic evidence linking her to the crime scene. The case still relied on circumstantial evidence, motive, behavior, and the story pieced together over years. However, every argument would face stricter scrutiny, and every statement would be judged against the legal errors that invalidated the first trial. The second trial began with this pressure. For the prosecution, it was a chance to fix past errors and present their theory with greater precision. Witnesses were recalled, old testimonies were presented again, and a narrative of tension, resentment, and alleged escalation was reconstructed for a new jury. The defense focused on the case's weaknesses. They highlighted the unchanged facts: no DNA, no murder weapon connected to Dana, and no eyewitness placing her at the scene. They argued that the case was still based on speculation, repackaged and presented again. The lack of direct evidence became their main defense. This time, the jury couldn't reach a verdict. The second trial resulted in a hung jury. There was no conviction and no acquittal, only disagreement. For the families of Mike Sisko and Karen Harkness, it was another delay in a nearly 2-decade-long process. Prosecutors faced a choice: drop the case or try again. They chose to continue. A third trial was scheduled. By this point, the case had evolved beyond a simple prosecution. It had become a test of endurance, legal, emotional, and personal. Witnesses had aged, and memories had been repeatedly revisited. The events of 2002 were distant history, constantly reconstructed in court. But the central question remained: who committed the crime? In the third trial, prosecutors presented their case carefully, aware they were under close observation. The defense maintained that the evidence was insufficient, and reasonable doubt remained. This time, the jury reached a guilty verdict for Dana Chandler. Over 2 decades after the murders, the legal system reached the same conclusion it had previously, but this time, the verdict stood, informed by past errors and experience. The case was finally resolved legally. However, this resolution does not undo the past, restore the lives lost, or answer every question. It closes the legal chapter, but opens a new one. The verdict leads to sentencing and a final reckoning. The trial ended, but the weight of the case remained. After the guilty verdicts, the focus shifted to Dana Chandler's sentencing for the murders of Mike Sisko and Karen Harkness. For the families, this was a moment of finality, not closure, after years of delays and uncertainty. The legal question of responsibility had been answered. However, time had changed everything. Children grew up, parents aged, and memories evolved. The justice delivered in the courtroom couldn't undo the events of 2002. It was late, but necessary. The case left behind a record of how justice can fail and recover. The first overturned conviction showed that a belief in guilt doesn't justify bypassing fairness. The second mistrial showed how doubt can persist despite investigation. The third trial showed how persistence from prosecutors and families can keep a case alive. This case wasn't solved by one piece of evidence. There was no DNA match or confession. Instead, it was built gradually, contested repeatedly, and decided based on accumulated evidence and a convincing narrative. Even so, questions remain. Circumstantial cases always leave room for debate. Some believe the evidence was sufficient, while others feel it didn't fully eliminate doubt. What is certain is the loss of Mike Sisko and Karen Harkness, who were building a life. The case ultimately returns to the reality of those lost lives. Justice, even when served, does not undo the past, it only defines it.
On a quiet spring night in 2015, the town of Somerville, South Carolina, was shaken by a disappearance that would soon unravel into one of its darkest tragedies. Ashley Pegram, a 28-year-old single mother of 3, disappeared after meeting a stranger online. This is not just the story of Ashley's final hours, it is a story of betrayal, of a family's desperate search for truth. It was spring 2015 in the quiet town of Somerville, near Charleston. Ashley, a hard-working single mom raising 3 young children, had connected with someone on the app Meet Me. They had also been messaging on Kik for about a month before deciding to meet in person. On the evening of the 3rd of April, 2015, around 9:30 p.m., Edward picked her up from her home in a Hyundai Sonata. The next morning, Ashley's family received a message claiming she had been dropped off at a gas station because she was too drunk. But that story didn't make sense. Ashley wasn't the type to disappear without checking in, especially with her kids waiting at home. Panicked, her family immediately reported her missing, leading to a community search and an urgent police investigation. To truly understand why Ashley's disappearance struck such a deep chord, we need to look at the woman behind the headlines. Ashley Pegram grew up in Somerville, South Carolina, in a close-knit family that valued togetherness. She shared a modest home with her mother and sister, Brandy Chance, sometimes even sharing one phone for the whole household. At just 28 years old, Ashley was already a devoted mother of 3. Friends and family described her as a loving, playful parent, the kind of mum who turned chores into games and always put her kids first. But life hadn't been easy. Years earlier, the father of her sons had passed away, leaving her to grapple with grief. At times, she leaned on alcohol to cope with the pain, though her mother made sure those struggles never touched the children. That April evening, Ashley told her family she was heading out for a casual night, just a drink or two. She wore jeans, a grey sweater, and new shoes, keeping it simple. When Edward Bonilla, 30, the man she had been talking to, arrived in his Sonata, he didn't come to the door or introduce himself. He just waited in the car, which struck her family as odd. Still, Ashley got in, and the two drove off. They ended up at a bonfire hosted by Edward's brother. It was a casual gathering. People around a fire, others playing ping pong in the garage. Ashley seemed relaxed, chatting with people she'd never met before. One attendee later recalled that Ashley was friendly and easy to talk to. She had a couple of beers from the 6-pack she'd brought, but showed no signs of intoxication. She was steady, engaged, and in control. By about 11:45 p.m., Edward decided it was time to leave. Ashley wasn't in a hurry. She still had beer left and seemed to want to stay, but he took the rest of her 6-pack and ushered her out. Just after midnight on April 5th, they pulled into a gas station on College Park Road. Security cameras captured Ashley going inside at 12:04 a.m., using the restroom, and leaving at 12:11 a.m. She appeared fine, calm, and composed. She got back into the Sonata, and the two drove off together. After that, according to Edward's later account, things got heated in the car. He said Ashley started yelling, accusing him of stealing her mum's phone. Even though she hadn't taken the family phone with her that night, he claimed she became so upset that she wandered out near a mobile home park, which was only about 1.5 miles from her house. He said he let her out there to use the bathroom again and then drove off after the argument, assuming she would walk home. But as the hours passed and Ashley never returned, it became clear something far more sinister had happened that night. Ashley's house was silent that night. Her usual, "Mom, I'm home," never came. At 3:29 a.m., Edward sent a kick message to the family phone, saying he hoped Ashley was okay. He claimed he left her at a gas station because she was too drunk. However, this didn't match what others saw at the bonfire, where Ashley didn't seem very intoxicated. By morning on the 4th of April, the silence became unbearable. Ashley's mother noticed she hadn't returned, so she checked the phone and saw Edward's message. Her sister, Brandy, immediately began calling his number over and over. When Edward finally called back, his story shifted. Now he claimed he'd dropped Ashley near a mobile home park. That sudden change sent alarm bells ringing. Brandy and her mother rushed out, walking the dark roadside near the park, peering into ditches, terrified she might have fallen or been struck by a car. They found nothing. Still, Brandy couldn't shake the sinking feeling in her chest. As hours passed with no sign of Ashley, panic grew. The family reached out to friends, spreading word of her disappearance. Everyone knew Ashley would never abandon her children. By that evening, her mother called dispatch to file a missing persons report. She laid out the details of the date, the late-night messages, and just how out of character this was. With those early red flags, the Dorchester County Sheriff's Office quickly took action. Detective Sergeant Martin was assigned on the 7th of April, just days after Ashley was last seen. He started where most cases begin, with the people closest to her. Brandy recounted everything, the shared family phone Ashley had left behind, the 3:29 a.m. kick message, and Edward's inconsistent stories, Martin quickly saw that this wasn't a case of someone walking away from their life. Ashley had no history of disappearing. She was a devoted mother, with no enemies, no bitter disputes. Her world revolved around her kids. Friends and neighbors echoed the same picture. Ashley was lively, photogenic, the kind of person who lit up family gatherings. No one recalled seeing strange cars beyond Edward's Sonata that night, nor hearing arguments near the house. Still, some hinted at her vulnerability, saying grief sometimes led her into impulsive choices. One friend remembered Ashley was depressed, making poor decisions and things like that because of it. Neighbors joined the family in combing ditches and wooded lots, but the searches came up empty. Police pushed flyers, took in tips, and monitored social media, but no breakthrough came. Then came Edward. On the 8th of April, at 6:00 p.m., he walked into the sheriff's office for an interview. At first, he seemed cooperative. He outlined his story, picking Ashley up, going to the bonfire, her drinking, the stop at the gas station, the argument about a stolen phone, and finally dropping her near the mobile home park. He even pointed to a scuff mark on his car's front right quarter panel, claiming Ashley had kicked it in anger. But Martin's eyes caught a detail Edward didn't expect. The mark wasn't shaped like a normal kick. It was narrow at the bottom and wider at the top, exactly the kind of impression you'd see if someone had been on their back, kicking upward. Edward also slipped in small lies, like claiming he was unemployed due to an ankle injury, that raised even more suspicion. Investigators moved fast to test his story. They pulled security footage from the gas station on College Park Road. The video confirmed the timeline: the Sonata pulling in at 12:04 a.m., Ashley stepping out, calm and steady, using the restroom and getting back into the car at 12:11 p.m. She wasn't stumbling. She wasn't distressed. The footage shattered Edward's claim that she was too drunk to stand. Then, investigators turned their attention to the mobile home park. Edward swore he dropped Ashley there, but nearby surveillance told a different story. A garage at the intersection had cameras pointed directly at the road. When detectives reviewed the tapes, no Hyundai Sonata appeared during the time frame Edward described. His alibi collapsed on the spot. Why insist he'd been there if the cameras proved otherwise? Detectives circled back to the bonfire, re-interviewing attendees. Edward's brother's girlfriend, who had known the family for years, gave a clear impression. Ashley arrived around 9:30 p.m. Friendly, steady, and in no way stumbling drunk. In fact, Ashley wanted to stay longer, but Edward abruptly ended the night, even scooping up the beers she'd brought. Other guests echoed the same. Ashley was relaxed, social, enjoying herself. No aggression. This painted a starkly different picture from Edward's story of a drunk, unruly woman. Then came a breakthrough from an unexpected source. A tip from Edward's ex-girlfriend revealed he wasn't unemployed at all. He worked at cobble flooring and had access to company vans. When Detective Martin confronted him at the job site, Edward fumbled, claiming he had just started a few days ago. His boss quickly corrected him, saying Edward has been working there for 8 months. The lie raised even more questions. Why conceal his work? What was he hiding about those vans? Investigators acted fast. Edward's boss mentioned that he had seen Edward heading to the company van as if to retrieve something. Martin moved quickly, securing the Ford Econoline before Edward could touch it. Inside, the site was chilling. Red stains streaked the walls, ceiling, and scattered items. A dented polyurethane missing its handle, tested positive for blood. Detectives collected Ashley's DNA standards, a toothbrush, a hairbrush, and sent everything to the lab. Within days, results came back. The blood in the van was Ashley's. The spatter patterns suggested something far worse, that she had suffered repetitive force while still alive. Attention then shifted to the Sonata. With Edward's mother's cooperation, investigators located it in North Charleston and seized it for processing. No obvious blood was found, but the suspicious shoe print on the car's panel was preserved. Step by step, Edward's carefully spun story was unraveling. Digital forensics made the noose even tighter. Cell phone records showed Edward's device pinging towers far from his normal routes. On the 4th of April, between 6:44 a.m. and 7:12 a.m. His phone was in Harleyville. Hours later, pings placed him back near work. What was he doing there? Search efforts widened. Authorities scoured reservoirs near Edward's apartment complex, even calling in the Department of Natural Resources to help scan the alligator-infested waters by boat and air. But no trace of Ashley surfaced. Still, investigators knew the case was building. By mid-April, the evidence was overwhelming: blood in the van, phone pings pointing to suspicious travel, witnesses contradicting Edward's story, and his lies about even the simplest details. On the 15th of April, 2015, detectives decided enough was enough. They moved to arrest Edward Bonilla for obstruction of justice, citing his repeated deceptions. When officers arrived at his apartment complex, the scene only deepened their suspicions. Edward was dragging a suitcase toward a rental SUV, seemingly preparing to vanish. The timing was telling. He was taken into custody without resistance. What began as a missing persons case was now a homicide investigation, with Edward squarely in the spotlight. To understand Edward Bonilla, investigators dug into his background. Born and raised in Dorchester County, he attended local schools, where classmates remembered him as someone who blended in with the crowd. He had a brother, Anthony, and the family often gathered for casual get-togethers, like the bonfire Ashley attended that night. Outwardly, Edward seemed ordinary, with a steady job and a long-term girlfriend, but text records revealed another side. While making plans with his partner about dinner and intimacy, he was also messaging Ashley. It painted the picture of a man leading a double life, showing little concern for loyalty or honesty. Professionally, Edward had worked at Cobble Flooring for 8 months, installing flooring and driving company vans. His criminal record was minimal. No serious charges that might have raised alarms, but people who knew him later described a pattern of disregard toward women. When first questioned after his arrest, Edward stuck to the story he'd told before. He repeated the detail about her supposedly accusing him of stealing her mother's phone and kicking his car in anger. But detectives pressed him about the inconsistencies, particularly the surveillance footage showing no Sonata near the mobile home park. As the weeks passed and evidence like Ashley's blood in the van was presented, his answers grew evasive. Though he never confessed outright during interrogations, the walls were closing in. By early May, the case took a decisive turn. On May 5, 2015, based on the forensic results and the mounting circumstantial evidence, Edward Bonilla's charges were upgraded to murder. Investigators didn't believe the crime was premeditated. Instead, they theorized it stemmed from a confrontation that escalated into violence. His pattern of disrespect toward women, combined with Ashley's resistance that night, suggested the encounter spiraled out of control. Just 3 days later, on May 8, 2015, during a private consultation with his attorney, Edward finally broke. He revealed the location of Ashley's body, a remote, wooded tract off Brown Road near Harleyville, the same area where his phone had pinged weeks earlier. Authorities launched a search immediately. On May 9, 2015, search teams, including Volunteers and dogs scoured the site. Deep in the woods, far from any main road, they discovered Ashley's remains. She had been there for more than 5 weeks, lying face down in the mud. Her body was naked except for a red bra, partly wrapped around her neck. Nearby lay a black garment. Her eyeglasses, later matched to family photos, confirmed her identity. Black electrical tape was still looped around her right wrist and neck. Clear evidence of restraint. The autopsy ruled her death a homicide by violence. Discolorations on her scalp were consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. Even after the discovery, Edward's story shifted only slightly. He suggested that restraint during the altercation had gone wrong, but he stopped short of taking full responsibility. By then, however, the evidence spoke louder than his words. The investigation had moved into its next phase, preparing for trial. The trial began on August 8, 2016, in Dorchester County and lasted 4 days. The prosecution argued that Edward intentionally killed Ashley, presenting a timeline of lies and physical proof. They showed gas station surveillance footage of Ashley appearing sober, which contradicted Edward's claim that she was extremely drunk. Phone records and cell tower data showed Edward was in remote locations like Harleyville soon after Ashley disappeared. Near where her body was eventually discovered, experts testified that bloodstains on Edward's work truck showed repeated blunt force trauma, consistent with autopsy results. The prosecution also pointed out that Ashley had a muscle relaxant called cyclohexanone in her system, which she had no reason to take, suggesting she was drugged without her knowledge. Furthermore, the prosecution emphasized that Edward's story changed multiple times, including where he claimed to have left Ashley. They also highlighted his lies about his job and his attempt to escape before being arrested. The prosecution concluded that his actions were not accidental, but a deliberate cover-up of a crime. The defense argued that Ashley's death was a tragic accident caused by a misunderstanding. Edward testified that Ashley became angry after they stopped at a gas station, accusing him of stealing and getting out of the car. He said he accidentally ran her over while backing up. Then, to stop her from attacking him, he held her in what he described as a bear hug, possibly a chokehold. He didn't realize she had stopped breathing until it was too late. Edward admitted he panicked. He put Ashley in the trunk of the Sonata temporarily, then left her on a frontage road. Later, he used his work van to move her body and bury her in a shallow grave. Using a board as a shovel, the defense pointed out that Edward had no serious criminal record. They suggested that the blood evidence was consistent with an accidental struggle, not a deliberate murder. They asked the jury to consider lesser charges, such as involuntary manslaughter, arguing that it was a brief loss of control without any intention to kill Ashley. After deliberating, a jury found Edward Bonilla guilty of murder on August 11, 2016. The judge described the handling and disposal of the body as particularly cruel and sentenced Edward to life in prison without parole. He appealed the conviction in 2019, arguing issues with evidence, admission, and trial conduct, but the South Carolina Court of Appeals upheld the decision, affirming the life sentence. In the quiet streets of New Haven, Indiana, what began as an ordinary night between a married couple soon turned into a scene of horror. A blood-soaked staircase, a frantic call to 911, a husband barely clinging to life, his wife's calm voice telling dispatchers he fell, but nothing about that night felt like an accident. The bruises, broken bones, and her unsettling calmness all suggested something more sinister beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect marriage. Friends who once saw Kevin and Allison Davis as the ideal couple began to wonder, had love turned deadly inside their home on Douglas Lane? By morning, Kevin was dead. Allison was a widow and a suspect. What followed was a tangled story of conflicting accounts, haunting evidence. And one question that still divides their Indiana community: was it a tragic fall or a deliberate murder? Kevin Davis was born on July 1, 1983, to his mother, Alta Beers. From an early age, everyone liked him. His friends described him as kind, hard-working, and always willing to help others. At the age of 40, Kevin worked as a gardener and had a stable life in New Haven, Indiana. One day, he met Allison by chance. They fell in love, got married, and lived together in a house on Douglas Lane. They didn't have children, but adored their pit bull mix, Willow, whom they treated like family. To their friends, Kevin and Allison seemed like a happy couple with a full, active life. Jason Young, a friend of Kevin's, said he could sometimes be loud and opinionated, but it was all part of his personality. Allison worked in retail at Victoria's Secret, where she made everyone feel welcome and valued. She and Kevin often affectionately called each other babe. Everything about their life looked happy and stable. But beneath that surface, something dark was brewing. On the evening of Friday, August 11, 2023, Kevin arrived at East Haven Tavern around 9 p.m. Taking his usual seat at the bar while waiting for Allison to finish work. When she arrived, they greeted each other warmly. Their friend, Jason, was also there, and the three of them enjoyed drinks and laughed all night long. Kevin had a few beers and vodka shots, while Allison sipped her usual sweet cocktail. Bartenders said the night seemed completely ordinary. Around 1 o'clock Emission, on August 12, Allison left first, with Kevin following soon after. They both headed home to Douglas Lane, ready to call it a night, but within hours, everything changed. At 1:11 a.m., Kevin texted Jason after getting home. Jason asked if they made it back safely. Kevin apologized and said everything was fine. He was just listening to music. They kept chatting for over an hour, with Kevin sounding cheerful and joking around. Finally, at 2:31 a.m., Kevin sent one last text saying he was going to put his phone on silent because he needed to go to sleep. Between 2:31 a.m. and 4:38 a.m., something terrifying happened inside Kevin and Allison's home. At 4:38 a.m., Allison called 911. The call lasted about a minute. In a calm tone, she told the dispatcher that her husband had just fallen down the stairs, that there was blood everywhere, and that she couldn't flip him over. She added that she didn't know whether he was alive or dead. Detective James Kruger later said the call sounded rehearsed. Allison never asked dispatchers to hurry, and he believed her tone was more focused on herself than on Kevin. Officers Garrett Shanebrook and Corporal Cade Hetrick arrived within minutes. Allison met them outside and led them in. At the bottom of the staircase, they found Kevin lying face down in a large pool of blood. Blood covered the walls, railing, and floor, with spatter reaching high above the stairs. Kevin was barely breathing, with blood flowing from his nose and mouth. His body temperature was 91 degrees Fahrenheit, dangerously low compared to the normal 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Corporal Cade Hetrick, who witnessed the scene, commented that this didn't look like a fall to him. There were no signs in the house that suggested a hard fall. No damaged railings, broken furniture, or dents in the walls. Kevin's body was lying flat, not twisted or wedged, as one might expect from a fall. The amount of blood made Hetrick ask Allison if there were any firearms in the house. Fearing Kevin might have shot himself, Allison confirmed there were firearms, but none were found near Kevin's body. Paramedics rushed Kevin to Parkview Regional Medical Center, but Allison's behavior immediately struck them as unusual. While talking to paramedics, she was laughing. She didn't seem worried about her husband's injuries. No tears. No attempt to ride in the ambulance. Detective Kruger was present at the scene and began the interrogation. Allison said that around 1:00 a.m., after returning from the bar, she and Kevin got into an argument. Kevin went upstairs to sleep, and she lay on the living room sofa. She said she woke up to a loud noise and found Kevin lying at the bottom of the stairs, thinking he was just drunk and had fallen. Allison agreed to let Kruger search the house and signed a permit. However, she warned him not to enter a room upstairs because of a guard dog named Willow. She said she did not want to go near that room. Kruger agreed not to enter the room where Willow was staying. When he opened the door slightly, Willow growled and bared her teeth. The dog wouldn't let him in. Other than that, the house appeared normal, and Kruger believed Allison's story that Kevin's fall had been a tragic accident caused by intoxication. The crime scene was cleared the same day. Allison's father, Steve Krauser, came over to clean up the blood, wanting to help his daughter in her grief. Meanwhile, Kevin's condition at the hospital worsened. His mother, Alta Beers, had received a text from Allison early that morning saying, "There's been an accident." Alta texted back for details, but got no response and went back to sleep. Assuming it wasn't serious, around 6:30 a.m., Alta finally spoke to Allison by phone and was surprised by how calm she sounded. Allison's tone made Alta believe that everything was fine, but it wasn't. Kevin's friends, Jason and Todd Spessert, hurried to the hospital. They spoke with Allison and her parents. Jason thought Allison had been crying, but was trying to hold herself together. Todd said she looked distraught. Inside Kevin's room, Allison stood by his bedside, calling to him as her father watched helplessly. Kevin suffered his third cardiac arrest that evening. At 10:07 p.m. on August 12, 2023, doctors removed him from life support. 40-year-old Kevin Davis was gone. Allison, 33, was now a widow. Friends were heartbroken. Everyone believed it had to be an accident, a terrible fall. But 3 days later, everything changed. On August 15, 2023, Dr. Scott Wagner performed Kevin's autopsy and discovered devastating injuries. The right side of Kevin's skull was crushed, with several fractures. The injuries were confined to his head. No other trauma was found. Dr. Wagner determined the damage was consistent with a fall from at least 20 feet or a high-speed car crash. The injuries would have rendered Kevin unconscious within seconds and brain-dead upon impact. He concluded that Kevin's wounds could not have been caused by a fall down a normal staircase. The evidence suggested Kevin had been struck in the head with a blunt object. The Allen County Coroner's Office ruled Kevin's death a homicide on October 17, 2023, caused by blunt force trauma to the head. Detective Kruger sat in his office, processing the information. If Kevin was murdered, it meant someone else did it, and the only person with him that night was Allison. Kruger reviewed the text messages between Kevin and Allison. When he read Kevin's last text message to his wife, he felt that there was something unusual about the content, not at all gentle. Kruger sensed tension between them. Then he discovered something even more troubling. Allison had given conflicting accounts of what happened that night. To police, Allison claimed she and Kevin had been drinking and argued after returning home. She said she slept on the couch while Kevin went upstairs. To Kevin's mother, Alta, Allison claimed Kevin had not been drinking and that they had been in bed upstairs when Kevin got up for water and accidentally fell down the stairs. To Kevin's brother, Allison said that she was in bed with her dog, Willow, and heard Kevin moving around but didn't pay attention because Willow was still lying there. She only went to check on Kevin later and found him fallen. And to the medics, Allison said she hadn't heard anything and hadn't seen Kevin for some time before finding his body. The stories contradicted one another, and Kruger believed Allison had been caught lying. Doctors also found something alarming. Kevin's body temperature was so low upon arrival at the hospital that he was hypothermic, and his brain had almost no oxygen. One doctor said she had seen drowning victims with higher oxygen levels than Kevin. This suggested Kevin may have been brain dead for hours before Allison called 911. 4 weeks after Kevin's death, Kruger met with his mother, Alta. She told him that Kevin and Allison were having marital problems and were possibly about to separate. This reinforced Kruger's suspicions. He believed that Allison had lost control and beaten her husband to death, possibly with a blunt object such as a kettlebell, dumbbell, or baseball bat, and then staged the crime by dragging his body down the stairs. However, no weapon was ever recovered. Kruger theorized that it might have been hidden in the upstairs bedroom with Willow, a room he hadn't searched. The thought haunted him. Kruger admitted that he completely regretted not having searched that room on the morning of the 12th, and that the murder weapon could have been there on December 22, 2023. A warrant was issued for Allison's arrest. 3 days before Christmas, she arrived at the Allen County Jail with her parents and told the officers that she was Allison Davis and that she was there to turn herself in. She was handcuffed in front of them. Allison was charged with murder and held without bond. For the next 17 months, she remained in jail, able to see her family only during attorney visits through plexiglass. There were no video calls or regular visits, only waiting. From her cell, Allison told loved ones she couldn't sleep because she kept reliving that morning. She said she missed Kevin deeply and longed to hear him call her babe again. The prosecution believed their case was solid, but the defense saw things differently. On May 6, 2025, Allison Davis went on trial for murder. Chief Deputy Prosecutor Tissa Helge presented Dr. Bill Smoke as her key witness. Dr. Smoke, known for testifying in high-profile cases, including those of Derek Chauvin and Robert Feldman, was described as a police surgeon showing the jury CT scans of Kevin's skull. Dr. Smoke testified that Kevin had suffered multiple blows to various areas of his head. He concluded that Kevin had been beaten to death, not fallen down the stairs, and that a blunt object, possibly a kettlebell, weight, or baseball bat, had likely been used. The prosecution focused on Allison's calm tone during the 911 call, her inconsistent statements, and her behavior with paramedics. They argued that Kevin's body placement at the base of the stairs did not match a natural fall. Crime scene technician Timothy Garrett testified that the blood found in the hallway and living room could not have come from a stair fall, stating that blood cannot turn a corner. Dr. Smock testified that Kevin's low body temperature showed he had been lying there for at least 2 hours before the 911 call. The prosecution claimed Allison had delayed the call to create her story and hide the weapon. The defense, led by attorneys Andrew Baldwin and Max Wiley, countered that there was no murder weapon, physical evidence, or motive. They argued Kevin had been legally intoxicated and fell down the steep stairs, hitting his head on the banister post. For support, they brought in Dr. Bisa Dragovic, a forensic neuropathologist specializing in brain injuries. Dr. Dragovic testified that Kevin suffered only one head impact when he hit the banister post. That single, powerful blow shattered his skull in multiple places, causing his brain to bounce inside his head as bone fragments acted like shrapnel. He also disputed the prosecution's interpretation of Kevin's low body temperature. According to Dr. Dragovic, the impact destroyed Kevin's hypothalamus, the part of the brain that regulates temperature, causing his body to cool abnormally. The low temperature, he said, was evidence of severe brain damage, not a delayed emergency call. He explained that the absence of blood on the banister was due to Kevin's internal injuries. The bleeding occurred inside his head and exited only through his nose and mouth. Baldwin criticized the police investigation, pointing out that the crime scene was released the same day. Photos were taken 4 days later, and Allison's father was allowed to clean up blood. Friends described Kevin and Allison's marriage as happy. Jason said Kevin's joking text about his wife was just a joke. Wiley argued that Allison was not the kind of woman who would violently attack her husband. The jury never saw data from Allison's Garmin smartwatch, which the defense claimed supported her version of events. Judge Fran Gull ruled the data inadmissible after 6.5 hours of deliberation on May 9, 2025, around 11:00 p.m. The jury returned a verdict, not guilty. Allison Davis was acquitted of murder. Her father, Steve, watched as she broke down in tears of relief, though she remained in jail briefly for release processing at 2:12 a.m. On May 10, Allison walked out of jail to Cheers after spending 17 months behind bars. Her first meal as a free woman was wings and pizza. An anonymous juror said the reason they acquitted was because the prosecution had no convincing evidence, no weapon, no hard evidence, no way to determine how the crime happened. Dr. Dragovich's testimony helped them better understand Kevin's trauma. Without solid evidence, they couldn't convict Detective Kruger. Now the police chief was devastated. He said that he was 100% convinced Allison had murdered Kevin, adding that his biggest regret was not having searched the bedroom shared with Willow, where he believed the weapon might have been hidden. Kevin's mother, Alta Beers, showed grace, despite her grief. Alta took comfort knowing Kevin's organ donations saved 4 lives. Allison returned to her parents' home with Willow, choosing a quiet life as she tried to rebuild after losing her husband and spending 17 months in jail for a crime. The jury said she didn't commit. Kevin's death remains officially classified as a homicide. The case is still unsolved, and no one has been held accountable. On a quiet summer afternoon in Bushey, Hertfordshire, a town known for its calm streets and close-knit community, a brutal crime shattered the sense of safety that residents had long taken for granted. By nightfall, 3 women from one respected family were dead, and police were warning the public about a dangerous fugitive armed with a crossbow. At the center of the tragedy was the Hunt family, admired locally and known nationally through the work of John Hunt, a trusted BBC racing commentator. Their lives, once defined by ordinary routines and shared happiness, were suddenly rewritten into one of the darkest chapters in recent British criminal history. The Hunt family lived in Bushey, a town where neighbors knew one another by name and life felt steady. John Hunt was the head of the household, a respected racing commentator for the BBC. His distinctive voice had become a fixture for thousands of listeners, admired for its energy, precision, and ability to capture the thrill of the moment. His wife, Carol Hunt, was the heart of the family. Her care kept the home warm and stable. Carol looked after the details, from daily meals to supporting her daughter's passions. John and Carol had 3 daughters. The eldest, Hannah, built her career in the wellness and beauty industry, finding purpose in helping others feel confident. The middle daughter, Louise, chose a different path. After working in salons, she followed her love of animals and, in 2022, opened Groom and Glow, a dog grooming business that quickly became popular. Louise even trained in pet first aid, which earned her the trust and admiration of her clients. The youngest daughter, Amy was no longer living at home full-time, as she was beginning to establish her own independent life. Though the three sisters pursued different interests, they shared a strong bond with their parents, keeping the family close. To outsiders, the Hunts were the picture of a happy, thriving household. Meanwhile, in Enfield, North London, a very different story was unfolding. Kyle Clifford, born in 1998, grew up in instability. His family moved often, leaving him without roots or long-lasting friendships. School life was turbulent, marked by aggression, discipline issues, and frequent conflicts. By his teenage years, Clifford was already seen as someone volatile, quick to anger, and difficult to be around. Searching for direction, he joined the British Army. But military discipline didn't bring him structure. It only amplified his inner turmoil. Fellow soldiers noticed his fixation on violence, his disrespect toward women, and his combative attitude. Even in such a rigid environment, he stood out for the wrong reasons. Ignoring orders, provoking fights, and disregarding rules, his time in service ended quickly, and by 2022, he was back in civilian life, directionless and unstable. What followed was a string of failed attempts to settle down. A job in private security collapsed after repeated conflicts with colleagues. His erratic behavior pushed people away, and slowly he withdrew further into himself, his isolation feeding his anger. Two lives, one rooted in stability and love, the other in instability and rage, were on a collision course. Their meeting would mark the beginning of a tragedy. Louise met Kyle Clifford in 2022. Around the same time, she was devoted to launching her dog grooming salon. He was drifting after leaving the military. Their connection began with messages and casual meetups. At first, Louise is intrigued by Kyle's curiosity about her work. He asked questions, praised her dedication, and seemed like a supportive listener. The first few weeks seemed calm. Kyle was punctual, quick to reply, and engaged warmly with Louise's family. To her, these gestures looked like signs of emotional maturity. She hoped that her support could help him find the balance he seemed to lack. But her family wasn't convinced. They noticed flashes of temper that unsettled them. Carol, her mother, urged Louise to focus on his actions rather than his words. John, her father, kept his distance but remained cautious. Even her friends shared quiet concerns. Sensing that something darker lingered beneath Kyle's polite exterior, over time, small warning signs began to emerge. At first, it was light criticism, comments on Louise's appearance, but they soon escalated. He started questioning her work clothes, her colleagues, even her clients. What he framed as concern gradually turned into control. He wanted her to share her location, respond to texts and calls immediately, and explain every outing or delay. Even short visits to her parents could spark suspicion. If Louise didn't answer fast enough, the messages turned into a barrage of interrogations. What unsettled her most was his online behavior. Kyle spent hours consuming videos from influencers who glorified dominance, mocked vulnerability, and spread toxic ideas about women. After watching, he'd become tense, irritable, and increasingly insistent that obedience was a partner's duty. By the end of their first year, even though they weren't living together, Kyle's rules and expectations made Louise feel as though she were under surveillance 24 hours a day. Kyle saw Louise's independence as a threat. Her family and friends noticed the changes. Louise began withdrawing, seeing people less often, her easy smile now shadowed by tension. To those closest to her, it was clear her independence was slipping away, one concession at a time. His jealousy grew more erratic. He accused her of being too friendly with clients or obsessively analyzed every comment on her social media. For Kyle, Louise's ties to the outside world weren't normal relationships. They were dangers to be eliminated. Louise tried to rationalize his behavior. At first, she told herself it was insecurity, that with patience he might change. She softened her tone, chose words carefully, avoided certain topics, all in the hope of preventing his outbursts, but the effort left her exhausted. Fatigue set in. Even though outwardly she tried to maintain her cheerful image, what had once felt like a supportive relationship slowly morphed into a system of constant control where trust faded, replaced by pressure and demands. Occasional glimpses of tenderness kept her holding on, but those moments slowly disappeared. By late June 2024, Louise knew she had to end the relationship. The breaking point came after a stressful period that culminated in a car accident. He lost control and hit a pole. Though her injuries were minor, the crash became a wake-up call, forcing her to step back and reassess. On June 24, Louise sent Kyle a calm, deliberate message. She explained that she needed to end things for the sake of her mental health. She emphasized that it wasn't about blame, asked for mutual respect, and urged him not to turn the breakup into more hurt. She ended with hope that he'd focus on caring for himself. At first, Kyle's reply seemed measured. He thanked her for her honesty, wished her peace, and said he still loved her. For a moment, it looked like he had accepted her decision, but the calm didn't last. Soon, her phone lit up with a flood of long texts and voice notes. His tone shifted from understanding to pleading to insistence. He begged for another chance, talked of a fresh start, saying this time he'd prove his love with action, not words. He then came repeated apologies for earlier outbursts and promises to make up for past mistakes. But when he didn't get the responses he wanted, his messages became inconsistent. Declarations of love turned into desperate pleas. Then short messages meant to make Louise feel guilty, followed by sudden flashes of anger. It was no longer a real conversation. Instead, it turned into a stream of long messages where Kyle asked questions and then answered them himself. By the end of that week, the tone had shifted again. Louise was no longer the person he directly blamed. Instead, he focused on those he thought had interfered. His texts mentioned her mother and sister more often, and at times her friends, even her clients. He said they had influenced her, that they had ruined the relationship. In his mind, Louise's choice was not her own anymore. He rationalized his obsessive behavior by believing it was part of a grander scheme. A new pattern soon appeared, trying to control her surroundings from a distance. For her, this confirmed she had done the right thing by ending it. Her own replies grew shorter, more neutral. She avoided arguments about the past and tried to stay calm, not wanting to get pulled into another emotional fight. For Kyle, though, her silence meant something else. To him, it was a signal to push harder. His focus shifted from persuading Louise to blaming the people he thought had taken her away. In his mind, she hadn't chosen to leave. She had been taken. To get her back, he thought he needed to get rid of her family's influence. That change in thinking marked a turning point. By early July 2024, Kyle had stopped thinking about reconciliation. His actions became deliberate and organized, aimed at preparing for an attack. His online searches included disturbing phrases: how to kill someone, how to restrain a person, which weapons were most effective. The searches showed careful planning. He decided on a crossbow, bought online with bolts for just over £350. Soon after, he added a field dressing knife for under £100. More purchases followed. A heavy roll of duct tape, several bundles of rope, and containers of petrol. In one shop, security footage showed him pausing between one large spool of rope and 2 smaller ones. As if considering which would work best, he also bought an air-powered weapon as a backup if the crossbow failed. Each item had a clear purpose. Nothing suggested impulse. Everything pointed to preparation. Surveillance was also part of the plan. Kyle followed Carol Hunt's social media accounts to track her routine. He checked John Hunt's sports commentary schedule to make sure the father would be away that day. Even the weather forecast was part of his planning. He looked at the predictions for 9 July, knowing that rain or heat could affect how he carried out the attack. By the start of July, Kyle Clifford had completed his plan. He had the tools, had written notes about his intentions. He also knew that John Hunt would be away, leaving only the women he now saw as his targets. The morning of 9 July 2024 began normally for the people of Bushey, a quiet town in Hertfordshire. It was a warm summer day. Residents went to work, walked their dogs, or did their shopping. The atmosphere was calm and typical for a weekday. Kyle Clifford's morning looked ordinary too. He spent time with relatives, went with them to a garden supply store. CCTV showed him walking calmly, pushing a stroller, smiling and chatting, looking like any young man out on errands. He seemed relaxed and normal, but underneath, he was fixed on his plan. That shopping trip was simply the final step in hiding what he intended to do next. At around 1:30 p.m. on July 9, 2024, Kyle Clifford drove toward Ashlyn Close in Bushey, the quiet street where the Hunt family lived. He parked his vehicle a short distance away so it wouldn't attract attention. Roughly 10 minutes later, he began watching the house. He wanted to be sure that John was away at work and that only his wife and daughters were home. Once convinced, he went back to his car to collect a bag. On the surface, he carried only a few neutral items, some of Louise's old belongings, and a small card, meant to make him look like he had come peacefully. The weapons he had prepared were kept hidden nearby, ready to be retrieved when the moment came. His plan was to use Carol's natural kindness to gain entry. Just before 2:00 p.m., Clifford approached the front door. He appeared calm and restrained, giving the impression of someone wanting closure. When Carol answered, she saw nothing threatening. He spoke softly, acted polite, and seemed composed. Believing he wanted to talk, she let him inside. That was when his demeanor changed. Clifford pulled out a knife and attacked. The first blows struck her chest and stomach, followed by repeated cuts to her arms and back. The pattern of wounds showed she fought hard to defend herself, raising her arms to block the blade, but she was quickly overpowered. Within moments, she collapsed from her injuries. Clifford then stepped out briefly to collect the crossbow he had hidden nearby. By this time, Louise was at the house, working in the small space she used for her dog grooming business. When she came inside, Clifford restrained her. He taped her wrists behind her back, bound her legs, and covered her mouth with duct tape. She was silenced and unable to move. Not long after, 28-year-old Hannah Hunt returned home. The moment she walked in, she saw Clifford holding the crossbow. She quickly realized the danger, tried to raise the alarm. She managed to send a short message to her boyfriend. It would be her final warning. Clifford aimed and fired. The bolt struck her in the chest. Though mortally wounded, she was still conscious and tried to move. But her strength faded. Despite her injuries, Hannah managed to dial 999. The call handler could hear her weak, fading voice as she tried to give details. The call dropped more than once, but the dispatcher stayed connected, relaying the information as armed units and paramedics were rushed to the scene. When officers arrived, one coordinated outside while others entered the house. Inside the hallway, they found Hannah, a crossbow bolt still lodged in her chest. Medics tried desperately to stabilize her, but her condition was critical. A search of the house revealed two other victims. One, an older woman with multiple stab wounds, was identified as Carol. The other, a younger woman, was found restrained with tape and showing signs of trauma. This was Louise. All three women, Carol, Louise, and Hannah Hunt, were confirmed dead shortly after emergency services arrived. Officers quickly set up a double security perimeter around the area. Alerts were sent across all units describing a male suspect armed with a crossbow and possibly additional weapons. Police were instructed not to engage directly, but to report sightings immediately. Forensic teams began documenting the scene in detail. They recorded body positions, visible signs of struggle, and the placement of items around the home. A roll of silver duct tape, lengths of rope, and other materials used to restrain the victims were collected as key evidence. Investigators traced blood along the stairwell and by the front entrance, helping them reconstruct Clifford's movements. It was also confirmed that John, the family's father, had been absent, reinforcing the belief that the timing of the attack had been chosen to isolate the women. Meanwhile, officers launched a door-to-door operation across the neighborhood. Residents were instructed to stay indoors and check their CCTV, video doorbells, or dashcam footage from earlier in the day. Several neighbors later reported hearing screams, but admitted they had not realized the severity of the situation. Police also requested surveillance footage from local shops and petrol stations to trace possible routes out of the area. At the command center, analysts reviewed incoming video in real time to map Clifford's escape. By evening, Hertfordshire police confirmed the case had entered an active manhunt. The search zone around Bushy Park was widened. Armored response units, K9 teams, and helicopters were deployed. Officers advised locals to report immediately if they saw anyone carrying concealed items or acting suspiciously in wooded or park areas. Spot checks were carried out on cars, garages, and abandoned buildings. Clifford had left the Hunt residence in just minutes. Preliminary evidence confirmed he departed around 6:55 p.m. Security cameras recorded a man walking with something wrapped in a light-colored cloth, later identified as the crossbow. He moved calmly, then got into a vehicle and drove away. These images became critical, proving he remained armed and dangerous. That same night, Hertfordshire police issued a direct appeal to Clifford, urging him to surrender. Warnings were broadcast across TV, radio, and social media alongside his photograph. Residents were told not to answer the door to strangers. By then, the story had become national news. Analysts pieced together CCTV and traffic camera footage, confirming Clifford's vehicle had traveled toward North London, where his family lived. By the morning of July 10, the search was focused around the Clifford family home. At about 8 o'clock a.m., armed officers entered the property. Inside, they recovered handwritten notes, some addressed to family members with farewell-like messages, others detailing his intentions. These documents confirmed the killings had been planned and that Clifford had not expected to remain at large for long. Later that day, an anonymous tip placed a man matching Clifford's description at Lavender Hill Cemetery, only a short distance from his family's address. Armed units sealed the area, setting up both inner and outer perimeters. K9 teams and paramedics were positioned nearby. Officers approached a mausoleum and used loudspeakers to identify themselves, demanding the suspect exit with his hands visible. Movement was detected inside. After repeated warnings, Clifford turned the crossbow on himself and fired. The fatal shot ended the 24-hour manhunt. Paramedics were cleared to enter once tactical officers confirmed the scene was secure. Inside the mausoleum, they located the suspect lying on the floor with a crossbow bolt lodged in his upper torso. His condition was critical, pulse faint, breathing shallow, skin pale and clammy. On-site medics stabilized him enough for transfer and notified trauma specialists about the likelihood of spinal cord damage, internal bleeding. The wound was not instantly fatal, but it left him with life-threatening injuries. The mausoleum itself was sealed off as a crime scene. Evidence inside was photographed, catalogued, and removed, including the weapon used in the self-harm attempt and several personal items. The timeline of the operation, from the first perimeter setup to entry, was logged in detail. Later that evening, Hertfordshire police officially announced that the suspect, Kyle Clifford, had been found and taken into custody. The public threat was declared over. Clifford was transported under armed guard to a trauma center. Emergency surgery stabilized him, but doctors confirmed severe, irreversible spinal damage. The injury left him paralyzed from the waist down and significantly impaired his ability to speak. Prognosis for recovery was poor. He would remain dependent on a wheelchair, require constant medical care, and face lifelong disability. After several days in the intensive care unit, Clifford was moved to a high-security recovery ward with restricted access. Once doctors confirmed he was stable enough, investigators scheduled the first formal interview. The session took place in his hospital room. Detectives from the homicide unit were joined by a representative from the Crown Prosecution Service and his court-appointed defense attorney. Recording equipment was set up for both video and audio. The interview began with confirmation of his identity, followed by a reading of his rights. Clifford nodded in acknowledgement, asked for water, and, after a long pause, said quietly in French he was sorry and that it was cruel. From that point, he refused to elaborate. Every substantive question about motive, planning, or responsibility was met with the same phrase, "No comment." Investigators read excerpts from handwritten notes recovered from his home and vehicle, outlining preparations for the attack. They laid out records of online purchases, the crossbow, the knife, rope, duct tape, and fuel. He listened, but gave no response. Questions about his relationship with Louise Hunt, his grievances against her family, or his movements on July 9th yielded nothing beyond the repeated refusal to speak. Medical staff monitored his condition closely, and each session ended once his blood pressure and breathing began to deteriorate. A second and third interview were attempted in the following weeks. Both followed the same pattern. Clifford confirmed he understood what was being asked, but declined to provide details. Apart from the single apology on record, it gave no insight, no acknowledgement of the planning, and no indication of remorse. It was a conscious choice to remain silent, leaving investigators to rely solely on evidence rather than testimony. Once his condition stabilized further, the case moved to trial. Psychiatric evaluations confirmed that Clifford was mentally competent to participate in proceedings despite his physical disabilities. He was transported to court under strict security, seated in a reinforced wheelchair fitted with restraints. Throughout the hearings, he displayed no visible emotion. He pleaded guilty to the murders of Carol, Hannah, and Louise Hunt, but entered a plea of not guilty to the charge of prolonged abuse and cruelty toward Louise. This decision forced the court to hear graphic medical testimony about her injuries. Expert witnesses described, in clinical detail, the extent of the trauma she endured. Family members sat through the proceedings, listening as each fact was presented, compounding their grief. The trial itself was relatively brief. The evidence compiled during the investigation was extensive, and Clifford's guilty pleas to the main charges left little room for dispute. After hearing all testimony, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts, including the charge of torture, despite his denial. The judge then delivered sentencing. Kyle Clifford received 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. plus additional consecutive terms for kidnapping, unlawful possession of weapons, and physical assault. In his remarks, the judge stated that the crimes were driven by hatred and selfishness, carried out with extreme violence and cold calculation. He described the murders as among the most brutal acts to come before the court in recent years. In his final remarks, the judge underscored that this was not a crime of sudden anger, but a calculated act driven by control, resentment, and deep-seated misogyny. He emphasized that the murders were premeditated, carried out with intent, and fueled by a desire to dominate. When the trial ended, only photographs of Carol, Louise, and Hannah remained on the bench across from the defendant. No longer items of evidence, they had become symbols of a family that had been erased. For the Hunt family, the conviction marked the formal delivery of justice, but it brought no sense of relief. 3 lives had been taken, and no sentence could ever repair that loss. The verdict closed a case that had gripped the nation, but it could not heal the wounds left behind. After the proceedings, the Hunt household was reduced to 2, John and his surviving daughter, Amy. He had lost his wife and 2 of his children. She had lost her mother and sisters. Their home in Bushy, once full of warmth, routine, was now a constant reminder of the day everything had been destroyed. John, long respected as a sports broadcaster, did not return to work. Amy, still in her early 20s, withdrew from public life, choosing silence over the unbearable attention. The legal chapter is over, but for John and Amy, the emptiness will remain for the rest of their lives. What lingers is the unanswerable question: how can anger and obsession consume a person to the point that they cross the final line and choose to kill? It was a warm summer night in July 1997, in a quiet neighborhood in Whittier, California, the kind of place where violence never happens. On a deserted street in the middle of the night, gunshots pierced the silence. When police arrived, they found a chaotic scene. Bruce Cleland, a respected software engineer, lying in a pool of blood. It quickly became clear that this was no random act of violence. It was something more planned, deliberate, and sinister. Bruce Cleland was born on March 31, 1954, in South Pasadena, California. He grew up in an affluent neighborhood with his older sister, surrounded by comfort and opportunity. Both of his parents were highly educated, financially secure, with strong signs of family wealth from earlier generations. From the outside, the Clelands looked like the perfect family: accomplished parents, well-raised children, and a bright future. Bruce was exceptionally intelligent from a young age. However, as a teenager, he discovered that his intelligence couldn't shield him from being treated cruelly. In 1968, he began attending South Pasadena High School, where his appearance and mannerisms made him a target for bullying. He was often teased and mockingly nicknamed Tiny Tim, after the entertainer known for his unusual voice and eccentric personality. For Bruce, the nickname cut deeper than just a jab at his slight build and soft-spoken voice. It symbolized how others saw him: gentle, awkward, and easy to dismiss. Yet instead of lashing out, Bruce endured the teasing with quiet resilience. He rarely showed anger and often coped by laughing at himself. His shy, reserved nature left him vulnerable. Throughout high school, he never dated, and his classmates thought he was weak. Still, he formed a small circle of close friends who appreciated his intelligence, kind personality. At home, his father, Harold Cleland, was his greatest supporter. The two shared a special bond, attending air shows and football games together, moments that gave Bruce a sense of belonging and strength. Romance intrigued him, but his lack of confidence kept him from pursuing relationships. Believing rejection was inevitable, he focused on academics instead. Science and technology became his refuge. Physics, mathematics, and computers fascinated him. His dedication paid off. By the time he graduated in June 1972, Bruce ranked among the top students in his class. He went on to attend Harvey Mudd College in Claremont, California, one of the country's most prestigious science and engineering schools. There, he experimented with social life, parties, beer, new friendships, but never let distractions interfere with his studies. In June 1976, he graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree and soon entered Stanford University, where he earned his master's degree in 1978. With his education complete, Bruce launched a successful career. He first worked at General Electric in San Jose, California, before later joining TRW as a software engineer. His projects were highly technical and sometimes involved classified contracts with the United States military. In 1987, Bruce transferred within the company and relocated to Redondo Beach. By then, he was earning over $100,000 a year, a remarkable salary at the time. Yet despite his income, Bruce lived simply. He drove modest cars, avoided luxury, and invested carefully in savings and stocks. For him, practicality always outweighed status, and by the late 1982, he had quietly built substantial personal wealth. Colleagues admired Bruce for his discipline and frugality. Every decision he made, whether financial or personal, reflected a thoughtful, methodical character. By the 1992, he was in his 40s, financially secure, and respected in his field. The shy teenager, once mocked in high school, had grown into a man with stability and confidence. Yet in matters of the heart, Bruce still seemed paralyzed. Years of solitude and inexperience left him uncertain and hesitant when it came to love. All of that changed in late 1995. That year, Bruce met a woman who would alter the course of his life, Rebecca. Their paths crossed at a local swap meet where Rebecca was selling spices. For Bruce, who had never been much of a dater, the encounter was electric. Captivated by her beauty and charm, he clumsily tried to impress her, even offering the idea of a job at an IT company. Rebecca handed him her resume. Soon afterward, Bruce called her. A relationship began. From the start, Rebecca's intentions appeared unusually direct. Within a week of meeting, she suggested marriage. For Bruce, who had never experienced such attention from a woman, the proposal was overwhelming yet deeply flattering. Eager for love, he agreed. Stepping blindly into his first serious relationship, Rebecca wasted no time. She introduced him to her 5-year-old son, claiming she had no contact with the boy's father and did not even know his identity. Almost immediately, she leaned on Bruce for financial support. Complaining about her living situation, she accepted his offer to rent her an apartment. Bruce furnished it, covered expenses, and even bought her a car. At first, it was a used Honda, but soon he upgraded it to a new Toyota after her persuasion. Over time, the requests grew bolder. Cosmetic surgery, jewelry, even a boat. For Bruce, who had spent years carefully saving, generosity felt like love. For Rebecca, it became a test of how much she could extract. Rebecca insisted on waiting until marriage for physical intimacy, something he interpreted as a sign of morality and self-respect. She claimed she had only ever been with one man, the father of her child. To Bruce, this made her unique, someone worth protecting and sacrificing for. When it came time to choose an engagement ring, Rebecca selected an extravagant diamond worth $10,000. Despite his normally cautious nature with money, Bruce eagerly paid. Soon after, she set her sights on a 4-bedroom house near Los Angeles, priced at $350,000, an enormous commitment for the mid-negative 1,990 seconds. Bruce purchased it, believing it was a gesture of love and security. They had a wedding in October 1996, but Rebecca wanted more. She envisioned a lavish church ceremony in January 1997, one she felt would showcase her true worth. Until then, she suggested that she and her son move into the new house, while Bruce wait until the church wedding before joining them. To Bruce, this seemed like a sign of tradition and respect. In reality, Rebecca had already discovered his greatest weakness, his innocence. She knew he was inexperienced with women, defenseless against manipulation, and utterly flattered by her attention. What Bruce saw as love, Rebecca quickly turned into leverage. But who was Rebecca, really? Her story had begun long before she ever met Bruce. Her mother, Lucy, grew up in Mexico, where she endured abuse that led to an early pregnancy. Pressured by her family to marry her abuser to avoid shame, Lucy entered a doomed marriage plagued by instability and poverty. Seeking escape, the family eventually immigrated to the United States, hoping for a better life. On August 15, 1969, Rebecca Salcedo was born in California, the third daughter in a family already marked by hardship. Her father abandoned the household when she was still a child, leaving her mother, Lucy, to shoulder the burden of raising 3 daughters alone. Years later, the family discovered that he had died, but by then, Lucy had long been forced into the dual role of provider and caregiver. Life in California was expensive, and though the extended family sometimes helped, money was always scarce. Eventually, Lucy remarried. Her new husband, Pedro Salcedo, accepted the girls as his own and tried to bring stability to the home. Still, Pedro was not wealthy, and the family's lifestyle remained modest, with every dollar carefully stretched just to cover essentials. Even with Pedro's support, Lucy's mental health began to unravel. Withdrawn and overwhelmed, she increasingly retreated from daily responsibilities. This left her daughters with little structure or guidance. Instead of a cohesive, supportive household, tension became the norm. The sisters quarreled constantly, competing against one another rather than working together. In this chaotic atmosphere, Rebecca quickly realized she could live without real authority over her. She came and went as she pleased, shaping her own rules. As Rebecca entered her teenage years, she embraced a lifestyle centered on attention, popularity, and freedom. Schoolwork became secondary. She preferred parties, shopping trips, and the thrill of being noticed. With natural charm and striking looks, she quickly learned that she could bend situations to her advantage. Boys offered her rides, gifts, and money, benefits she rarely turned down. By age 16, she took her independence to another level. She agreed to marry a man who desperately needed a green card. As a U.S. citizen, she could provide it, and in return, she received $2 million. This marriage of convenience marked a turning point. It was the first in a long series of calculated decisions where relationships became a means of survival, opportunity, and profit. The early 1,990 seconds introduced even greater turmoil. In 1991, Rebecca was arrested on charges of possession of illegal substances with intent to sell. The conviction resulted in a 3-year prison sentence. Around the same time, she discovered she was pregnant. When asked about the father, she admitted she had no idea who he was. On October 22, 1991, while still behind bars, she gave birth to a son. Her family cared for the child during her incarceration. Though sentenced to 3 years, she was released after roughly a year and a half for good behavior. This dark chapter would later be completely hidden from Bruce Cleland, who never suspected the reality of her past. Upon leaving prison, Rebecca faced the daunting challenge of rebuilding her life. No job, no degree, and the responsibility of a young child, but she soon entered a relationship that offered emotional refuge. Her partner was Sherry, a former police officer. To those who knew Rebecca at the time, Sherry seemed to be her true love. Rebecca even had Sherry's name tattooed on her leg as a permanent sign of commitment. For several years, from 1991 to 1994, Rebecca, Sherry, and her son built a life together. It was perhaps the most stable and genuinely happy period Rebecca ever experienced. That sense of stability was abruptly shattered in 1994. Lucy, long plagued by mental illness, took her own life. The tragedy devastated Rebecca. Friends and family noticed a dramatic change in her behavior. Once relatively steady, she became volatile, argumentative, and unpredictable. Her relationship with Sherry began to crumble under constant fights, infidelity, and Rebecca's return to partying. By the end of the year, the bond was broken. Rebecca once again found herself untethered, drifting from one social circle to another, seeking someone new to provide the security and attention she craved. It was in this vulnerable and unstable period that Rebecca crossed paths with Bruce Cleland. To her, Bruce represented something she had been seeking for years, a man who was gentle, trusting, and financially secure. She immediately recognized his naivety in matters of love and knew how to craft a persona that would appeal to him. She presented herself as principled, loyal, and morally upright. To Rebecca, Bruce was the perfect target, wealthy, inexperienced, and eager to please. Bruce, captivated by love, completely trusted Rebecca. He bought a house, looking forward to them living together. But the house quickly became a busy center of activity. Rebecca invited friends over frequently, hosted parties, and entertained men whom she introduced as cousins. Bruce never questioned her explanations. His deep trust, combined with his lack of relationship experience, left him unable to see what was happening right in front of him. In January 1997, their lavish church wedding finally took place, a ceremony designed to match Rebecca's ambitions and to project an image of perfection. To the outside world, they seemed like a success story. Bruce, the accomplished, intelligent professional, and Rebecca, the devoted young wife. But appearances were deceiving. At her bachelorette party, just days before the ceremony, Rebecca confided to friends that she didn't love Bruce at all. Her marriage, she admitted, was about one thing only: money. Bruce and Rebecca traveled to Hawaii for their honeymoon, but the trip only highlighted how fragile their union truly was. Even then, Rebecca could not hide her disdain. She called friends and ridiculed her new husband, describing her intimate life with him in cruel detail, saying it was the most humiliating experience of her life. Many hoped marriage might soften Rebecca, that with time she would grow into the role of a loyal partner, especially with a man as devoted as Bruce. He continued to shower her with kindness, patience, and loyalty, but Rebecca never even pretended to reciprocate. Once back from Hawaii, the thin facade of marriage crumbled entirely. Rebecca returned to late nights, wild parties, and lavish spending, burning through Bruce's money as though it were endless. Her infidelity was no secret. She saw other men openly, and while friends noticed, Bruce seemed unwilling, or unable, to confront the truth. Instead, he retreated into his work, spending less time at home and leaving Rebecca free to indulge in her desires. Within just 4 months of their wedding, the situation was irreparably broken. Rebecca began talking openly about divorce, boasting to her friends about the large settlement she expected to secure. What she failed to understand, however, was California's clear legal boundary, the fortune Bruce had carefully built before their marriage would remain his. Still, Rebecca pressed forward, determined to turn the marriage into profit. The first public cracks appeared in April when police were called to their home after a heated, loud argument spilled out of control. For Bruce, the tension and stress became unbearable. Naturally calm and soft-spoken, he was not a man prone to anger, but being forced out of his own home was a breaking point. He left the house and sought legal advice, slowly beginning to recognize what he had long denied. Rebecca's affections were never real. She was motivated purely by money. The division of assets after their split was not what she expected. Rebecca's dreams went up in smoke. Because Bruce had purchased his home and accumulated wealth before marriage, those assets were legally protected. The only amount subject to division totaled around $5,000, a devastating blow to her expectations. To Rebecca, it felt like an insult, yet she wasn't ready to let go. Even after their separation, she continued using Bruce's credit cards without permission. Designer clothing, glittering jewelry, nights at upscale restaurants, beauty treatments, and party expenses all found their way onto his statements. From the outside, Rebecca maintained the image of glamour and abundance. In reality, it was Bruce's steady paycheck that still fueled her lifestyle. Meanwhile, Bruce moved back into his parents' home. His attorney advised him to sever ties completely, to cut Rebecca off for good. But Bruce, hopeful to a fault, clung to the possibility that their marriage might be salvaged. Rebecca, ever calculating, sensed his weakness and dangled the idea of reconciliation. On the morning of Friday, July 25, 1997, she called him with a suggestion. Perhaps they could start over. To Bruce, it was the one thing he had longed to hear. That evening, they arranged to meet at the same restaurant where they had first gone on a date. Bruce picked her up, and by 9:30 p.m., they were seated together, sharing dinner. An hour later, they were back on the road. At Rebecca's urging, they stopped by her uncle's house, a man she often described as a father figure. The visit seemed ordinary, calm even. Around 1 o'clock a.m., they said their goodbyes and drove off. Rebecca was behind the wheel when their car pulled onto a quiet, isolated stretch of road. She suddenly claimed she needed to step out and check the tailgate. Bruce, sitting in the passenger seat, waited. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. The stillness of the night shattered as gunshots rang out. Bruce was struck and scrambled out of the car, attempting to flee, but another shot tore into his back. He collapsed to the ground, helpless, as the killer closed in and delivered a final shot to his head. From the window of a nearby house, a woman named Virginia Selva caught a glimpse of the horror unfolding outside. Horrified, she immediately dialed 911. When police arrived, they found Bruce lying lifeless, only feet from his car. Rebecca was seated near the hood, claiming she had been struck in the head and knocked unconscious, but detectives noticed something strange from the very start. Rebecca showed no panic, no tears, no shock. Instead, she calmly offered an explanation. It must have been a robbery. She even insisted that her diamond wedding ring had been stolen, yet investigators quickly noticed the inconsistencies. Her purse and cell phone remained untouched inside the car. Bruce's wallet, with cash inside, was still in his pocket. A medical examination showed she had no head injuries. When Rebecca sat down with investigators, her statements immediately struck detectives as odd. Rather than focusing on her husband's violent death, she spoke at length about her outfit that evening. their first date years earlier, and the restaurant they had just visited. None of it addressed the brutality of what had happened on that road. Detectives grew increasingly skeptical. A closer look at her background and at the short marriage itself quickly revealed troubling signs. Friends and acquaintances described a woman obsessed with material wealth, prone to extravagant spending, unfaithful to her husband, and openly dissatisfied with the marriage from the very beginning. Then came the discovery that shattered any lingering doubts. Just 1 month before Bruce's murder, Rebecca had quietly taken out multiple life insurance policies in his name, totaling roughly $1 million. On the documents, Bruce's signature had been crudely forged. If he were to die, Rebecca stood to inherit everything: his house, his possessions, and the insurance payout. Investigators also learned that Bruce was a man without enemies. No grudges, no disputes, no history of violence, but witnesses near the crime scene recalled something else. They had seen a young Latino male in the area that night. Detectives turned to Rebecca's phone records. One name stood out immediately: Álvaro Quesada, her cousin. He matched the witness description. The evidence trail closed in quickly. Under interrogation, Álvaro confessed to being the gunman. He admitted he had ambushed Bruce at Rebecca's request. His brother, José Quesada, also confessed to participating in the crime. Both men independently pointed to Rebecca as the orchestrator, the mastermind, who had manipulated them into carrying out the killing. The case proceeded to trial. In June 2000, Rebecca Cleland, along with Álvaro Quesada and José Quesada, were convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The jury determined the crime involved special circumstances, financial gain, and lying in wait. Rebecca showed no remorse throughout the proceedings. In 2003, she received her sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Today, she remains incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Corona. Álvaro and José are also serving life sentences in California state prisons. For Bruce's parent, the verdict provided accountability but little comfort. From the start, they had sensed something was wrong. They had pleaded with their son not to marry Rebecca, worried she cared only for his money. In the months following the wedding, they watched helplessly as his once bright spirit dimmed. Bruce eventually confided that he planned to file for divorce, but by then, Rebecca's plan was already in motion. Bruce Cleland's life had always been defined by quiet, determination, and deep kindness. First in his studies, then in his career, and above all, in the love he showed to family and friends. His murder at the hands of the woman he trusted most left everyone who knew him devastated. As his father later remarked with sorrowful certainty, "She planned it from the beginning." The story of Bruce Cleland remains a haunting reminder of how trust can be betrayed, how greed can corrupt love into something deadly, and how one man's simple, dignified life was stolen by someone who saw him only as a means to an end. In Norway's quiet political circles, few couples appeared more stable or respectable than diplomat Per Paust and his wife, Anne Orderud Paust, a high-ranking government official with access to the nation's most sensitive institutions. They were polished, influential, and widely trusted, but behind the calm facade of their professional lives, a threat was quietly closing in. When Anne returned to her family farm seeking refuge after her husband's sudden death, tragedy struck again. In a single night, 3 members of the Orderud family were executed in their sleep, and what looked at first like the work of a professional assassin would soon unravel into one of the most disturbing, tangled, and controversial criminal cases in Norway's modern history. Per Paust was born on December 1, 1943, in Norway. Always eloquent and quick-witted, It was no surprise that he pursued political science at university after completing high school. He later became a Norwegian diplomat, serving as press secretary for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and holding several other senior positions throughout his career. He was married to Anne Orderud Paust, born on April 3, 1952, who was also a well-known public figure in Norway and served as private secretary to the Minister of Defense. The couple lived a respected, successful life in Oslo, surrounded by political influence and responsibility. Around 3:30 a.m. on March 12, 1998, colleagues drove the couple home after an evening out. They had barely stepped out of the car when a stranger suddenly attacked Per. He grabbed Per by the tie, threw him to the ground, and began kicking him repeatedly. Anne rushed to help her husband, striking the assailant several times with her purse, but this only provoked him further. He turned on Anne and hit her hard across the head. She screamed for help. Several witnesses noticed the commotion. The friends who had driven them home saw the attack in their rearview mirror and returned to intervene. At that moment, the attacker abruptly stood up, turned around, and slowly walked away as if nothing had happened. He walked a short distance, then calmly circled back toward Per and Anne. But instead of attacking again, he merely walked past them, expressionless, before disappearing into the darkness. The entire encounter was strange and unsettling. When police arrived, multiple witnesses gave statements describing what they had seen. Despite their efforts, the attacker was never identified. His face had been concealed by the darkness. Investigators initially suspected robbery or retaliation linked to political disagreements. In time, Per and Anne recovered physically, but emotionally, they were forced to accept that the investigation had reached a dead end. About a year later, the attack had largely faded from public memory. On July 17, 1998, as the couple prepared to leave for work, Per got into his wife's car. As Anne approached from behind, she noticed something unusual beneath the rear wheel. She pulled out a black cylindrical tube, unsure of what it was, and brought it with her. Upon arriving at work with her husband, she immediately showed the item to a security guard. Although he was uncertain, he suspected it might be an explosive device. He urged them to contact the police, advice that proved critical. The bomb squad examined the object and confirmed it was a 500-gram stick of dynamite. Someone had affixed the explosive to their car. Anne and Per had no known personal conflicts, no apparent enemies who would want them dead. Detectives quickly suspected a connection to their professional roles, and a full investigation began. Police soon located a witness, the couple's neighbor. That morning, he had noticed a thin wire stretched across the street near the observation deck of the building where the couple lived. He hadn't thought much about it at the time, but it was now clear the wire had been a Bickford fuse designed to ignite the explosive. Believing it to be litter, he had picked it up and thrown it away. That seemingly insignificant action had unknowingly saved the couple's lives. Investigators recovered the discarded fuse along with the explosive for analysis, but neither yielded any useful leads. While the police were still investigating the bomb, another frightening and inexplicable incident occurred on August 12, 1998. Late that night, Per woke up to use the bathroom. As soon as he sat up, he noticed an overwhelming smell of gas and gasoline. When he approached the front door, the odor grew stronger. He opened it and saw a large metal cylinder outside, its valve open and hissing. A tube ran from the cylinder directly into their apartment. Per immediately contacted the police. When officers arrived, the 5-liter gas cylinder was still standing outside the apartment door. Almost all of the gas had already escaped. The cylinder was soaked in gasoline, and a clear trail of it led all the way down to the street. It was obvious the device had been deliberately set up to flood their apartment with gas for reasons that remain unknown. The attacker failed to ignite the gasoline and trigger an explosion, likely because Per had woken up, frightened him off. When police and firefighters entered the building, the air inside the apartment was so saturated with gas that even the smallest spark could have caused a catastrophic blast. Residents had to be evacuated immediately. Per and Anne were deeply shaken. They understood that someone wanted them dead. They were forced to stay with friends, while detectives and fire officials continued their investigation. The series of attempted attacks drew massive media attention, especially because the victims were high-profile government officials and the attempts appeared increasingly coordinated. Unfortunately, the case stalled. No fingerprints or traces were found on the cylinder, and once again, the perpetrator had managed to escape without leaving a single useful clue. Despite extensive police work, the investigation reached another dead end. While the case remained unsolved, Anne and Per received an offer to work in New York as consular officials. Both accepted enthusiastically and temporarily moved to the United States, hoping distance would shield them from the unknown threat looming over their lives in Norway. They considered the opportunity a much-needed escape. Living and working in Oslo had become far too dangerous. In January 1999, Anne and Per felt the situation had calmed and decided to return home. But any hope of a peaceful life in Norway quickly faded. Shortly after their return, Per was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. Only a few months later, on May 6, 1999, he passed away. Grieving and emotionally exhausted, Anne was devastated. She did not want to abandon her professional responsibilities, but she needed time, rest, and the support of her family. She decided to stay at her parents' farm in Surum while she recovered, because the identity of the person who had targeted her and her husband was still unknown. She kept her plans secret, sharing them only with her closest family members. Anne's father, Christian Orderud, was 81 years old, and her mother, Marie Orderud, was 84. They lived on the Orderud family farm, a large property with several houses. Anne's brother, also named Per, lived in the main farmhouse, while their elderly parents lived in a smaller two-story house nearby. Anne planned to stay with them for a while as she tried to regain her strength. On May 23, 1999, Hans, Anne's uncle and Christian's brother, drove out to the farm to visit the family. The funeral for Anne's husband had taken place only a few days earlier. Hans wanted to offer his condolences and support. When he arrived, he walked up to the smaller house and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. It was a warm, sunny day, so he assumed they might have gone for a walk in the woods behind the home. But something felt off, so he circled to the back of the house to check. There, on the terrace, he noticed broken glass scattered near the rear entrance. Looking up, he saw the second-floor balcony door shattered. Alarmed, Hans entered the house. The door was unlocked. Inside, he found a horrific scene. 47-year-old Anne lay lifeless on the kitchen floor. In the living room, 84-year-old Marie had also been killed. In the bedroom, 81-year-old Christian was found dead as well. Hans immediately called the police. A triple murder investigation began at once. By the end of the day, detectives had reconstructed the basic outline of what had happened. Sometime between midnight and 5 o'clock a.m., unknown assailants had climbed up to the second-floor terrace, smashed the glass door, and entered the house. All three victims were in their pajamas. Investigators concluded that more than one perpetrator had carried out the killings because the victims were shot with two different calibers, .22 and .38. The attackers first entered the bedroom where Marie and Christian Orderud were sleeping. Christian was shot first with a .38 caliber round. Although seriously wounded, He did not die immediately. In a desperate attempt to protect his wife, he managed to reach for a shotgun, stored in the wardrobe, but before he could use it, he was struck again by a .22 caliber bullet. He collapsed and died moments later. Marie also attempted to defend herself, but she was shot in the chest with a .38 caliber pistol. She did not die instantly. She tried to flee toward the living room, likely hoping to alert her daughter. There, she was shot again. Severely wounded, she collapsed onto the floor. Still alive, but rapidly losing blood, she slipped into unconsciousness and died within minutes. Anne, who likely woke to the sound of gunfire and screams, ran into the kitchen. She was immediately shot with a .38 caliber round. The injury was fatal, and she collapsed near the kitchen counter, dying instantly. Beyond these findings, investigators had very little to work with. The perpetrators left almost no physical evidence inside the house. Spent shells were recovered from both calibers, and a partial shoe print was found among the broken glass near the smashed door on the second-floor balcony. After processing the crime scene, forensic specialists expanded the search to the surrounding farmland. In the nearby woods, they discovered a heavily worn, yellow woolen sock. It appeared the killers had attempted to cover their shoes with knitted socks to avoid leaving identifiable prints. The thin heels of the socks tore quickly during movement. Part of one heel had detached and fallen off along the path. Since there were no other solid leads besides the shoe print, investigators began searching for shoes matching the pattern. They eventually located a store in the region that had sold two identical pairs in the relevant size. Unfortunately, the shopkeeper could not identify the buyer. At the same time, police began looking for possible witnesses. Their first priority was to question Per Christian Orderud and his wife, Veronica Orderud, who lived in the main farmhouse on the same property. Investigators believed they might have heard or seen something. Both appeared terrified. Per, especially, was visibly shaken by the brutal deaths of his parents and sister. The couple insisted they had no idea who could have done such a thing. The series of earlier attacks targeting Anne and her husband had deeply unsettled them as well. Per and Veronica provided little useful information. They claimed to have heard nothing that night. To investigators, this raised further questions. But considering the earlier use of explosives and gas, along with the likely use of silencers during the shooting, the attackers seemed meticulous and highly prepared. This would explain why the murders produced so little noise. The theory of a robbery gone wrong was dismissed almost immediately. Nothing had been stolen. The previous assassination attempts against Anne and Per also eliminated the possibility of coincidence. This was clearly a targeted attack driven by a personal motive. With that realization, the list of potential suspects narrowed significantly. The killers seemed familiar with the family's routines and circumstances. Very few people knew that Anne had quietly moved back to the farm after her husband's death. It was also likely not a coincidence that the attack occurred only days after she voluntarily withdrew her police protection. The lack of signs of a struggle suggests the victims didn't feel threatened by their attackers at first, indicating they likely knew each other. About 10 days after the triple murder, a witness contacted the police and reported that Veronica's sister, Kristin Kirkemo, had been acting unusually suspicious. According to the witness, Kristin frequently practiced shooting in a wooded area near her home. The claim raised immediate red flags. She was brought in for questioning. Her behavior at the police station only deepened the investigators' suspicions. She avoided direct answers, spoke vaguely, and seemed nervous. Police obtained a warrant to search her home. Kristin lived not far from the Orderud farm with her boyfriend, Lars Grønnerud. Both had a history of banned substances use and long-term dependency issues. Inside the house, police found a substantial quantity of explosives tools commonly used to manufacture explosive devices, and several firearms, including a .22 caliber weapon. Because one of the calibers used in the murders was .22, the firearm was immediately sent for ballistic testing. The results, however, did not match the weapon to the killings. Yet, the ammunition seized from their home matched the type of cartridges found at the crime scene, giving detectives reason to believe they were still following the right trail. Kristen's boyfriend, Lars, was also questioned. He confirmed owning a .38 caliber weapon, while Kristen had used the .22 caliber one during shooting practice. They claimed they were simply hunting enthusiasts who enjoyed target shooting. Despite these suspicious coincidences, investigators initially focused more attention on Anne Orderud Paust and her brother, Per Christian Orderud. Anne and Per Christian Orderud had been close since childhood. Both grew up on the Orderud family's land, but their lives diverged as adults and chose a different path. She attended university, completed her education, and entered political service. Her parents continued managing the family farm, but as Christian grew older, his health declined. He struggled to maintain the demanding workload. Around the time Per turned 30, Christian and Marie retired from active farm work and handed over management to Per Christian Orderud. Anne still had no interest in farm life, but retained her legal share of the inheritance. Nearly a decade later, when Per was about 40, a 21-year-old veterinary assistant named Veronica began working on the property. Despite the significant age difference, she and Per quickly became romantically involved, after which she moved into the main house. Tensions surfaced in 1997. Christian objected strongly to Veronica living in the primary residence. Around the same time, the farm's accountant discovered that Per had registered himself as the owner, even though he had never completed the agreed-upon payment to his father. Christian was furious and considered hiring a lawyer to renegotiate the terms, insisting his son had failed to honor their original contract. When Per learned of his father's intentions, he retaliated by filing a legal complaint. The conflict escalated dramatically. Father and son stopped speaking for an entire year. Instead of seeking reconciliation, Per sued his father, arguing that the written agreement proving the sale price was legally binding. He initially won the case, but Christian countered by filing an appeal, claiming his signature had been forged. The appellate court accepted his argument. The earlier ruling was overturned. Detectives noted that as the daughter, Anne would be the primary heir to the family farm if her parents died. Christian had reportedly been dissatisfied with Per's management of the farm and concerned about the loans Per had taken out, fearing they might jeopardize the estate's long-term financial stability. With these family conflicts now exposed, Per and Veronica quickly became prime suspects, but they weren't alone. Once investigators discovered that Kristen and Lars owned firearms compatible with those used in the killings, they too were added to the list. Per and Veronica denied owning any guns and insisted they were not involved. They claimed that on the night of the murders, they were asleep in the main farmhouse, had heard nothing unusual, but their alibi was weak. No one else could verify it. Moreover, given the close distance between the houses, their claim that they heard nothing raised serious doubts. Even with silencers, the breaking of glass, the forced entry, and the victim's screams should have been audible, especially in the quiet countryside at night. Their silence only intensified investigators' suspicion. All four suspects attended the funeral, but even cried, drawing attention from those present. Gradually, under increasing pressure from investigators, Kristin Kirkemo and Lars Grønnerød began to crack. They admitted that they had supplied Veronica and Per with the weapons and had helped plan the triple murder. Lars was noticeably less cooperative. He confirmed that he had given a weapon to Kristen, but insisted that he knew nothing about their intentions. He claimed he had been at home on the night of the murders, and his alibi was verified. However, he could not confirm Kristin's whereabouts. At first, Kristin was released due to a lack of solid evidence linking her directly to the killings. She denied participating in the shootings at the farm. Soon after, she returned to the police station and presented an alibi, claiming that she and a friend had spent the night delivering packages around the city. She even provided mobile phone records as proof. Digital analysis seemed to support her account. But when detectives questioned the friend, the truth quickly unraveled. The friend admitted she had not been with Kristin that night. Kristin had simply borrowed her phone and passed the activity off as her own. Once this lie was exposed, the police had enough grounds to arrest the entire group. All four suspects, Veronica, Kristin, and Lars, were charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and accessory to murder. 6 months passed as the investigation continued, with the primary objective of locating the firearm used in the triple homicide. During this time, the suspects remained in custody, but they suddenly recanted their earlier statements and sought release. Each suspect gave conflicting confessions throughout the interrogations. Per alone was questioned at least 17 times, and although his story shifted slightly each time, he appeared more consistent than the others. The suspects lied repeatedly, but they had coordinated their stories beforehand, so their versions overlapped in convenient ways. The murder weapon still had not been found. When Lars admitted he had sold one of the firearms, he offered almost no details about the buyer, claiming he didn't know the person. It was too little information to trace the weapon. However, he did provide one crucial piece of information. He said that Kristin had practiced shooting with that gun. He even showed detectives the exact place where she used to hang targets from a tree. At the scene, police recovered .38 caliber shell casings and several bullets embedded in the tree trunk. Ballistic analysis confirmed that these bullets were identical to those removed from the victims' bodies. This allowed investigators to link the weapon to the suspects, even without ever recovering the gun itself. However, this alone could not determine who had pulled the trigger on the night of the murders. The media covered the high-profile case relentlessly, sparking a flood of theories, one of the most popular being that the murders were connected to organized crime. Many believed that Anne Orderud Paust was the primary target because of her political role. Earlier assassination attempts on her and her husband seemed to support the theory, and her parents may have been killed simply for being witnesses. The constant media attention also triggered a wave of false reports from citizens seeking publicity, yet some tips had elements of truth. During the investigation, a woman working at a senator's office contacted police, stating that on May 15th, an anonymous caller had warned her that an attack was being planned on Anne. That same day, her colleague also contacted authorities about the call. Investigators attempted to trace it but failed. When this information became public, many became even more convinced that the murders were politically motivated. After all, how could the police fail to protect a high-profile government official who had already survived multiple attacks? Investigators also examined whether the suspects had been involved in the previous assassination attempts targeting Anne and her husband. They soon discovered that the explosives found in Lars and Kristin's home were identical to the dynamite planted under Anne's car the previous year. All of the materials, dynamite, Bickford fuses, and black tubes, had been obtained by Lars. The question of motive came up again and again throughout the investigation. While per Christian Orderud's motive was considered strong, centered on inheritance, ownership of the farm, and financial gain, the involvement of Veronica Orderud, Kristin Kirkemo, Lars Grenerud was more difficult to understand. Although all three might have been tempted by money, investigators found no significant transfers, withdrawals, or bank movements that suggested a direct financial reward. Eventually, however, Another picture began to form. After gaining full ownership of the Orderud farm, Per and Veronica planned to divide the large property into smaller plots, which they intended to sell individually to developers and private buyers. Veronica later admitted that Per had attracted her with promises of wealth, but neither Per nor Veronica possessed the experience or the weapons needed to carry out such a crime. That was when Veronica approached her sister Kristin and Kristin's boyfriend, Lars. She knew about their addiction issues and believed they would not refuse an offer that involved easy money. This suspicion was later confirmed when detectives found Veronica's diary, which contained harsh remarks about Christian and Marie. In it, she described Per's legal battles with his father and repeatedly expressed her wish that the elderly couple would disappear. Another motive soon emerged, one tied not to property or wealth, but to family. Kristin had given birth to a son several years earlier, but due to her banned substances use, she lost custody. Her sister Veronica quickly secured guardianship of the boy. As the official guardian, Veronica had strict responsibilities and could not allow Kristin unsupervised access. Kristin was only able to see her child when she visited the Orderud farm, but Anne's plan to sell her share of the farm threatened to unravel everything. It put both the family home and Per's expected profit at risk. For Kristin, it also threatened her only opportunity to see her son. Fearing that she would lose even this limited access, Kristin became deeply involved in the conspiracy and dragged Lars into it as well. When these elements finally came to light, the case moved rapidly towards sentencing. On June 22, 2001, Veronica Orderud and Kristin Kokemo were found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 21 years in prison. The maximum penalty in Norway. Lars Grenerud was convicted of illegal possession of a firearm and given 2.5 years, though prosecutors appealed, and his sentence was later increased to 18 years. During the appeals process, Kristin's sentence was reduced to 16 years, largely because the court could not determine conclusively who fired the fatal shots and who served primarily as accomplices in planning the murders. All 4 defendants have since completed their sentences and been released. Veronica was granted parole after serving 2/3 of her term. More than 14 years later, she continues to deny any involvement, giving occasional interviews in which she maintains her innocence. Although she divorced Per long ago, she still keeps in contact with him and visits the graves of the murdered Orderud family. Despite the convictions, some people remain unconvinced of their guilt. To many, the alleged motive, property disputes, inheritance, and family tension seem too convoluted to justify the killing of an entire household. Others argued that the earlier assassination attempts on Anne Orderud Paust and her husband pointed to a more powerful enemy. Some continued to believe that the murders were orchestrated by organized crime. Private investigator Tor Sandberg publicly suggested in 2009 that the Balkan Mafia may have been involved, citing the unusually rapid death of Anne's husband, which he believed resembled poisoning more than cancer. However, Norwegian police have consistently rejected these theories, continuing to insist that Per, Veronica, Kristin, and Lars were responsible for the murders. A breakup started like many others, filled with arguments, cold silences, and attempts to move on. But the woman in this story couldn't let go. Her love transformed into hatred. Obsession consume here. For the next 10 years, she relentlessly tried to ruin the life of the man she once lived with. Their failed relationship quickly devolved into a cycle of deceit, manipulation, and increasing violence. To understand how far she was willing to go, we need to go back to where it all started. Rob Parks was born in 1980 in a quiet suburb of Great Britain. He grew up as the middle child among 3 brothers. A good student, Rob focused on building a successful career. At 14, he moved north to study psychology and criminology at university. Though bright, he lacked self-confidence, was painfully shy around girls. That changed when he joined the University Drama Society. Within a year, he became its president. Acting helped transform him, his confidence grew, he began to open up socially. In 1990, Victoria Breeden joined the same drama society as an 18-year-old freshman. As the society's leader, Rob often interacted with her. He was instantly drawn to her. They began dating, and within 2 weeks, Victoria was practically living in Rob's dorm room. Her behavior soon struck other students as unusual. She insisted on spending every moment with Rob, even when it disrupted his studies. Deeply in love, Rob didn't see the red flags. Having little experience with women, he assumed this kind of intense closeness was normal. Still, even he couldn't ignore how obsessively attached Victoria had become. By then, Rob was 20 and Victoria 19. She gradually isolated him from everyone else, especially other women. Rob started to sense that something wasn't right. That summer, after finishing his exams, he insisted on breaking up, wanting to spend the holidays with his family without Victoria. Naturally, she resisted. She quickly found a way to manipulate him into resuming the relationship. Whenever Rob made plans to meet friends at a pub or go out, Victoria would call, claiming she felt unwell and might have endometriosis. She even underwent medical tests to prove it, though no diagnosis ever appeared in her records. Many of Rob's friends believed she was faking it to control him. Each time she complained about her health, Rob cancelled his plans and rushed to her side. After 3 years together, Rob had tried to end the relationship countless times, but never succeeded. Victoria was a skilled manipulator who always managed to reel him back in. They often broke up briefly. Rob even dated other women, but Victoria would always interfere, stalking and intimidating anyone new. One night in 2001, after yet another breakup, Rob met a new woman and invited her over. Just after they shut the door, someone began pounding on it furiously. It was Victoria. Even the neighbors recognized her by then. She claimed she had lost her keys and needed to stay the night. Rob, weary but kind-hearted, let her sleep in the spare room. The next morning, he woke up beside his new girlfriend to find Victoria lying on the floor next to them, staring at him. As soon as he opened his eyes, she started a fight. It was just one of many incidents showing how completely Victoria tried to dominate Rob's life. She refused to accept that he no longer wanted her. In May 2001, Rob graduated from university. Victoria continued stalking him, scaring off other women. Eventually, she wormed her way back into his life, and after both left the university town, they moved into a rented flat together. From that moment, life with Victoria became a waking nightmare. She spent nearly all day in bed, insisting she was seriously ill, a clear excuse to avoid working and keep Rob at her service. She isolated Rob from his friends and family. Everyone notices how badly she treats him. Victoria made him do almost everything for her, repaying him only with insults. Still, Rob believed she was truly sick and continued taking her to hospitals for tests. During one visit, a doctor quietly asked Rob whether his girlfriend really had any condition at all, noting that all her test results were normal. It was the same story at every hospital. After that conversations, Rob began to suspect that Victoria was faking her illness to manipulate him. But instead of facing the truth, he kept convincing himself she simply needed his care and understanding. Several more years passed. Victoria eventually completed her university degree, while Rob earned a master's in advertising. After graduating, they moved in with Rob's parents. It didn't take long for his family to notice that something was off. Victoria made little effort to communicate. Instead, creating invisible barriers that cut Rob and his parents off from each other. Her strange behavior was impossible to ignore. She spent most days lying in bed, while Rob acted as her full-time caretaker. Rod and Victoria lived there for several months before Rob tried, once again, to end the relationship. This time, Victoria went to extraordinary lengths to convince him they could fix things, but only if they lived on their own. Reluctantly, Rob agreed, and they soon moved into a place together in Milton Keynes. They married in April 2004, when Rob was 24 and Victoria 23. Their wedding was a small, quiet affair attended only by close family. But even at the ceremony, guests sensed something strange. There was no real joy between the bride and groom. After the wedding, they began their married life, living apart from his parents. From that moment, Victoria assumed total control over her husband's life. She criticized nearly everything he did. Her manipulation slowly eroded Rob's mental health. He began to suffer from insomnia, anxiety attacks, and long bouts of depression. Meanwhile, Victoria continued to complain about her supposed endometriosis, describing constant pain that, according to her, had plagued her for years. Eventually, she told Rob that a specialist had recommended an unusual solution. Having a baby, Rob wasn't keen on the idea, but Victoria knew how to persuade him. Before long, she became pregnant. In 2006, they welcomed a daughter. For the first time in 7 years, Rob had someone who truly gave his life meaning. He was working full-time at an advertising agency, proud of his achievements and focused on building a career. Everything seemed to be falling into place, except for Victoria. Her manipulative behavior only worsened. Whenever Rob was at work, she called constantly, claiming something was wrong with their child and demanding that he come home. Yet whenever he rushed back, he always found their daughter perfectly fine. By now, Victoria had completely isolated Rob from his friends and family. He kept his frustrations to himself, confiding to a few close acquaintances that he often felt trapped, that marrying Victoria had been the biggest mistake of his life. Shortly after their daughter's first birthday, Victoria announced she wanted another baby. She said it would be good for their daughter and might even strengthen their relationship. The conversation took place one day while they were driving. Without warning, Rob blurted out that he couldn't live like this anymore. After years of emotional torment, he told her he wanted a divorce and that he believed he could be a better father on his own. Victoria was stunned. She tried repeatedly to change his mind, but Rob stood firm. In April 2008, when their daughter was about 18 months old, he left the family home and contacted a divorce lawyer. After 4 years of marriage, it was finally over. Victoria remained in their house, while Rob rented a small flat, keeping his new address secret. For a time, he even stayed away from work, afraid Victoria might show up and try to win him back. Once free, Rob slowly rebuilt his life. He started dating again, made new friends, and reconnected with people from university. Victoria, meanwhile, didn't stay single for long. Barely a year after the divorce, she began dating a new man named Russell, who soon moved into the house she shared with Victoria and her daughter. She even forced the little girl to call him Daddy. Rob suspected that Victoria was doing it deliberately, just to hurt him. When their daughter was nearly 4 years old, Victoria called Rob in a panic. She claimed she was unwell and that their little girl had suddenly fallen seriously ill, needed to be rushed to the hospital. She insisted that the child was in critical condition. Terrified, Rob dropped everything and drove nearly 200 kilometers to get there. But when he arrived, he was stunned to find his daughter sleeping peacefully in a hospital bed. Doctors ran several tests and found absolutely nothing wrong with her. Victoria, however, continued to insist that her daughter was suffering from a variety of ailments. constipation, allergies, fever, you name it. Rob visited the hospital every day, increasingly confused. One afternoon, his daughter told him something that deeply unsettled him. Every night, her mother put a hot water bottle in her bed and closed all the windows. Even though it was the middle of summer, it suddenly clicked for Rob. Victoria might be faking or even inducing her daughter's illness. The thought horrified him. Months later, Victoria and Russell showed up at Rob's house, demanding that he return some of their daughter's clothes that had been left behind during a recent visit. Rob calmly told her that the clothes were in the wash and he'd drop them off later. That's when Victoria suddenly turned hostile. She began shouting insults, tried to push her way inside. When Rob blocked the doorway, she deliberately fell backward, screamed that he had attacked her. Russell had witnessed the entire exchange, and even he seemed confused. Victoria immediately called the police, but after officers arrived and listened to both sides, they concluded that Rob hadn't done anything wrong. He had merely stopped his ex-wife from forcing her way into his home. The police refused to take further action. Victoria was furious. And from that moment, Rob could tell she wasn't finished with him yet. A few months later, Victoria suddenly refused to let Rob see their daughter again, claiming that the child had become gravely ill once more. She even said she couldn't obtain one of the girl's prescribed medications. Suspicious. Rob checked the details and discovered that the drug in question wasn't suitable for children at all. That's when everything fell into place. He managed to review parts of his daughter's medical records, and there, among the doctor's notes, he saw a reference to possible Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a psychological disorder where a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in someone else, usually to gain attention or sympathy. Rob was shaken. He realized that his daughter wasn't sick. Victoria was making her sick. Over time, Rob noticed a disturbing pattern. Whenever his daughter stayed with him, she was perfectly healthy, but as soon as she went back to her mother, strange, unexplainable symptoms returned. Rob began to suspect that Victoria was deliberately harming their child just to manipulate him or force him to come running back. In early 2011, Victoria gave birth to another child, this time with her new partner, Russell. Around the same period, Rob met a woman named Jane through mutual friends, and later that year, the two married. But what should have been a peaceful new beginning quickly turned into something far darker. Soon after the wedding, Rob began receiving disturbing late-night phone calls from an unknown number. No one spoke on the other end, only the sound of heavy, deliberate breathing. At first, he dismissed it as a cruel prank. But as the calls grew more frequent and persistent, fear set in. Convinced that someone was watching him, Rob went to the police to report that he was being stalked. Detectives traced the anonymous calls and discovered they were all coming from burner phones, prepaid devices, and SIM cards purchased without registration. Several of the numbers were eventually linked to real individuals, but when investigators contacted them, the responses were baffling. Each of these people claimed they had been trying to buy illegal substances from a man named Rob Parks. Police immediately launched an investigation, but Rob had never been involved in criminal activity, let alone illegal substances. He was a clean-cut professional with no record and a deep aversion to anything illegal. When questioned, Rob was stunned. He denied everything and insisted that someone was trying to frame him. Detectives soon confirmed his story. There was no evidence connecting him to illegal substances, distribution of any kind. Still, the situation left him deeply shaken. Rob couldn't shake the feeling that only one person could be behind this: his ex-wife, Victoria Breeden. But without proof, there was little anyone could do. Then, just as abruptly as they had begun, the calls and messages stopped. Victoria, however, didn't stop meddling in Rob's life. She continued to make co-parenting nearly impossible. blocking his attempts to spend time with their daughter. When the girl turned 6, Rob planned a special trip to Disneyland, but Victoria flatly refused to give permission. Not long after, Victoria broke up with Russell and started dating a new man named Wayne Wood, a soldier in the British Army. She proudly announced she would follow him wherever he was stationed, even to Germany, where he was soon to be deployed. She intended to take both her children with her. Rob, fearing he would lose all contact with his daughter, fought back. The custody battle began. During this tense period, a shocking incident occurred. Wayne suddenly appeared at Rob's home, shouting accusations at him, claiming that Rob had abused his own daughter. Rob was horrified. The allegations were unimaginable. He immediately realized Victoria was behind this. She had told Wayne outrageous lies, manipulating him, just as she had done to everyone else in her life. Rob denied everything, and the confrontation eventually fizzled out, but the damage was done. Victoria's obsession with destroying him was escalating. Soon after, the harassment took on a new form. Rob began receiving anonymous messages from unknown numbers, calling him a child abuser and threatening violence. The messages were traced and documented. Again, Rob was certain it was Victoria, but police couldn't gather sufficient evidence to link them to her. Victoria then crossed an unthinkable line. In a calculated move to accuse Rob of child abuse, she coached their daughter to tell classmates that her father had hurt and molested her. When the story reached teachers, Child Protective Services launched an investigation, but during their first interview, the truth came out. The little girl had been coerced by her mother into lying. The case was quickly closed, and no charges were filed against Rob. Yet, unbelievably, Victoria faced no punishment for the false accusation. As the custody hearing approached, Rob could only hope it would finally end her campaign of harassment. Eventually, the court ruled in his favor. Victoria was forbidden from taking their daughter out of the country. Furious at the verdict, Victoria handed the child over to Rob and his wife Jane, then cut off nearly all contact with her. But rather than moving on, she began plotting something even darker. In October 2013, Rob received another chilling anonymous message, this time a death threat. The sender warned they would burn his house down. After years of psychological abuse, Rob had grown almost numb to the harassment. He chose not to report it. Then, on New Year's Eve 2013, police unexpectedly showed up at his home. They told Rob that an emergency call had been made, reporting a fire at his address. Everything seemed fine, and Rob explained his long history of stalking, harassment by his ex-wife. Officers took his statement seriously and promised to trace the source of the fake call, but before they could, the threats became real. At 5:30 a.m. the next morning, Rob was jolted awake by the deafening sound of the fire alarm. Looking out the window, he saw his Audi engulfed in flames. He immediately shouted for his wife and daughter to run out the back door. Seconds later, a massive explosion shook the entire house. As the fire crew rushed to the scene, Rob's phone buzzed again. Another message, once more accusing him of child abuse and promising death. Fortunately, the blaze was contained before it reached the house, but the family was left deeply traumatized. It took his daughter nearly 6 months to recover from the terror of that night. Naturally, police opened an investigation into the car fire and explosion. In 2014, Victoria moved to Germany with Wayne. Their daughter stayed in England with Rob and his new wife, Jane. For a while, Rob allowed himself to hope that distance would stop the harassment. He underestimated Victoria. Not long after, officers informed Rob that Victoria and Wayne had been stopped trying to smuggle firearms back into the UK from Germany. Months later, investigators concluded Wayne had been behind the false arson report. He was charged with making a false statement and with setting Rob's car alight. Victoria was summoned back to the UK for questioning, and police searched the house the pair had previously occupied, but came away without evidence tying her to the hoax call, so she initially avoided prosecution. Wayne, however, was convicted for the arson-related offenses and later sentenced to 7 years in prison. Shortly after his conviction, Victoria filed for divorce. By late 2018, it had been roughly 10 years since Rob and Victoria separated. Their daughter was 12. Rob was 38. He had tried hard to move on, but Victoria refused to let him. Then a man named Graham Wall messaged Rob, claiming to know Victoria, warning that she was dangerous. Rob didn't know Graham, assumed it was another trap. He ignored the message, and nearly a year passed. Then detectives contacted Rob again, saying a new threat had emerged. He agreed to meet them. To his surprise, they arrived with a local TV journalist and said his family would be featured in a documentary. Detectives told him they suspected his ex-wife had tried to hire someone to kill him. Graham turned out not to be some random stranger, but Victoria's newest boyfriend, a man she'd met on a dating site. They'd been together only a few weeks when she tearfully told him their daughter was living in appalling conditions and begged him to help rescue the child. Shockingly, she quickly urged Graham to kill Rob or find someone who would. Graham, appalled, suggested they contact Child Protective Services or pursue custody through the courts instead. Victoria dismissed him and called his objections a bad joke. Still uneasy, Graham planted a small recording device in the couple's flat. What he expected to capture, evidence of infidelity, turned out to be far worse. On tape, Victoria met with a man and discussed murdering her ex-husband. The recording captured detailed talk of setting Rob's car on fire to lure him outside and then bludgeoning him with a brick. On October 8, 2019, Graham took the recording to police. An attempted murder investigation was opened immediately. Victoria, far from panicking, presented herself at the police station the next day and claimed her personal belongings had been stolen, including the phone Graham had allegedly given to detectives. She tried to turn the story around, accusing Graham of framing her, even suggesting he had plotted the murder himself. A closer review of the audio, however, made the situation unmistakable. Victoria had been speaking with a man named Earl Gernon, an individual known to police for a criminal past and willing to arrange violent acts for money. The tape showed she had been shopping for a hitman. She repeatedly rehearsed lurid, fabricated allegations about Rob and described in cold detail how she wanted him caught, bound, led into the woods and killed. By the time police briefed Rob, Victoria was already under arrest on suspicion of conspiracy to murder. Earl was also brought to the station. He claimed their relationship had been casual and that he had not taken Victoria's requests seriously, even though, with his help, she had identified at least 3 potential killers. The trial began in early 2020, drawing the attention of many men whom Rob had never even met before. Each of them took the stand to testify that Victoria had approached them, trying to hire them as hitmen to kill her ex-husband. To justify her actions, she told them that Rob was a child abuser and claimed she only wanted to save her daughter from him. Investigators later discovered that Victoria had been searching for someone to carry out the murder as far back as 2014, offering different sums of money, up to 5,000 British pounds, to anyone willing to do it. Before the trial, Victoria was examined by several psychiatrists. Surprisingly, all of them agreed that she was completely sane and fully aware of her actions. Ultimately, she was found guilty on 3 counts of soliciting to commit murder. The court sentenced her to 9 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving roughly half her term. This means that Victoria Breeden could appear before the parole board for the first time by the end of 2025. In the aftermath, Rob spoke openly to journalists, expressing his frustration that Victoria would remain part of his life for years to come. He feared that once released, she might try to contact their daughter again. It was the life many dreamed of, a waterfront mansion in Jupiter, Florida, a decades-long marriage that had survived betrayals and a seemingly unbreakable family. But behind those luxurious doors were simmering resentments, mounting secrets, and a love that had begun as a youthful fairy tale that had slowly rotted over the years. On the night of September 30, 2011, it all finally exploded. The sound of an alarm shattered the silence, followed by a series of gunshots. Soon, the house fell silent. In the bathroom, Lanny Horwitz lay in a pool of blood, wrapped only in a towel, shot to death in a way no burglar would dare. This is not a robbery, nor is it a stranger's murder. It's a family tragedy fueled by jealousy, resentment, bankruptcy, and a love triangle about to go awry. In just a few days, investigators have unraveled a web of lies, anger, and betrayal so complex that even seasoned detectives find it hard to believe. This is the story of the Horwitz family, where love turns to tragedy, loyalties crumble, and the question is no longer who had a motive, but who didn't. Lanny Horwitz was born in Buffalo, New York, and raised by a single parent. He had a brother named Barry, and the two remained close throughout their lives. From a young age, Lanny was ambitious, hardworking, and full of promise. He initially focused on his studies, but soon realized that his true passion lay in business. At 16, Lanny began working as a real estate salesman in his father's commercial real estate business. Before long, he became a broker and impressed everyone around him with his drive and enthusiasm for the profession. Outside of work, Lanny's main focus was Donna, his high school sweetheart. They met when Donna was 14 and Lanny was 15, and quickly became inseparable. Lanny later told his family that he knew right away she was the woman he wanted to marry. They married in 1967 and built a happy life together. They settled in an affluent neighborhood in Admiral's Cove, Jupiter, Florida, a place so safe that violent crime was almost unheard of. Their success afforded them a luxurious lifestyle, with multiple homes, frequent travel, and financial security. Lanny accumulated great wealth through real estate, owning sailboats, airplanes, and a collection of cars. He was considered to be very good at managing his personal life and became a millionaire at a young age. Donna never needed to work, focusing instead on their home and family. The couple had one son, Radley, who later followed in his father's footsteps and entered the business world. They also had a granddaughter, to whom Lanny was deeply devoted. For decades, their family life seemed ideal. But after about 30 years of marriage, their relationship began to unravel. In May 2001, Donna and Lanny divorced, only to remarry a few months later in September. By the summer of 2002, they separated again. Their on and off relationship became widely known, resembling the ups and downs of a soap opera. Their first divorce stemmed from Donna feeling lonely and believing that her husband no longer cared for her. She sought new feelings and began an affair with a security guard in the house. When Lanny discovered the affair, he was furious. He fired the guard and immediately demanded a divorce. Although he later realized he still loved Donna, he was never able to forgive her completely. For 9 years after that, their relationship continued in fits and starts. Despite multiple attempts to move on, they kept returning to each other. In 2011, Donna moved back into the home in Admiral's Cove, as recorded in her diary. At that time, their son, Radley, was also having difficulties, so he moved back to live with his parents. At first, family and friends noticed how happy Lanny and Donna seemed to be reunited. They spoke hopefully about starting fresh and rebuilding their family, but it soon became clear that Lanny's resentment had never faded. He often reminded Donna of her betrayal, and those around them realized that living with him had become increasingly difficult. On the night of September 30, 2011, Radley was sleeping in his bedroom at his parents' house in Jupiter, Florida, where the family lived after his parents decided to retire. That night, he awoke to the blaring sound of the home alarm and loud bangs that sounded like gunshots. Terrified and unsure of what was happening, Radley stayed in his room, afraid he might be the next victim of a possible intruder or murderer. Suddenly, he heard his mother, Donna, screaming his name. More gunshots followed, several in quick succession. Then, everything fell silent except for a few clicking sounds. Radley, familiar with guns, recognized that the shooter had run out of ammunition. Even then, he hesitated to leave his room. Uncertain about what was going on or whether it was safe, the air was eerily quiet, except for the sound of the alarm. After a moment of waiting, Radley left the room and walked down the hall to his parents' room at the end of the house. The bathroom light was on, and the door stood wide open. Inside, he saw his 66-year-old father, Lanny Horwitz, lying on the floor in a pool of blood. He wore only a towel, stained and spattered. It was clear, from one look, that his father could not be saved. He gasped once and then went still. Radley feared his mother had also been killed, but he found her alive, sobbing uncontrollably on the bedroom floor. Leaving her there, he rushed to the home's control panel to silence the alarm. By then, security guards from their gated community had arrived. They called 911, reiterating Donna's statement that Lanny had harmed himself without knowing the true situation. Police and emergency responders soon arrived. They found Radley and Donna together and then discovered Lanny's body. Next door was the guest house of Anita, who was away that night. The police were only able to speak to Radley and Donna. Donna said that Lanny had mentioned wanting to end his life earlier that evening. She said everyone had gone to bed before being awakened by the alarm and gunfire. Both she and Radley told police they believed an armed intruder had broken in. Inside the bathroom, officers found extensive blood splatter and a body so damaged it was difficult to tell how many times Lanny had been shot. However, evidence quickly suggested foul play. A bullet hole in the bathroom, glass and blood inside the shower stall indicate that Lanny was shot while showering, which is unlikely in the scenario that ended his life. It took 10 hours for the medical examiner to complete the examination. Lanny was shot 9 times, completely incapable of ending his life. The crime was brutal. The final bullet had been fired into his mouth, likely as an act of rage meant to silence him. Investigators determined that the attack began while Lanny was in the shower. After being struck, he apparently opened the shower door and collapsed, where he was shot again at close range. At the scene, Radley stayed composed and cooperated fully with police. Donna, however, withdrew after her initial story was challenged. At first, the police thought she was in shock, but later, her strange behavior made them suspicious. There were no signs of forced entry. The alarm company confirmed that the doors had not been opened or locked that night, indicating that no one had entered the house. Only Lanny, his wife Donna, and their 37-year-old son Radley were present. The security cameras offered no useful footage. Some were broken, and others did not record any intruders. Early on, investigators suspected that the alarm was triggered by noise inside the house. During the search, police found an extensive firearms collection, possibly too large. It included pistols, revolvers, shotguns, rifles, and various attachments. There were 26 guns and thousands of rounds of ammunition, in total, all stored in military ammunition crates. Most were registered to Lanny and Redley. Lanny had collected guns for years, and Redley had a gun license and had shared his passion with his father since childhood. Investigators focused on 2 revolvers found in the master bedroom. Donna's gun, found in Lanny's possession, was a 5-round revolver, with 1 chamber empty. The second gun was on the dresser. Ballistics tests showed that both guns had fired 10 shots, 9 of which hit Lanny. A large number of ammunition rounds and shell casings were also found in the room. Initially, suspicion fell on Redley and Donna, but both were released. While detectives continued to review the evidence, it took several days to collect and analyze everything, including the family's personal belongings. The evidence collected revealed that life in the house was far from peaceful. Donna's diary provided the clearest insight. Initially, she seems delighted when Lanny offers to move in with her. But note that this only happens after he asks to borrow $200,000 from her parents. His business was failing after a series of divorces, the recession, and poor financial decisions. In the 5 months after moving back, Donna's journal entries became increasingly dark and disturbing. She wrote that Lanny was getting into her head, describing constant tension and conflict. Shortly before the shooting, the name Francine Tice began appearing in her entries. Francine lived nearby and had originally been Lanny's business partner. They were both distributing health food products, met at a conference, and started communicating more frequently. Their working relationship quickly became too intimate. According to Redley, the family noticed a change in Lanny after meeting Francine. He became happier and more enthusiastic than he had been in years. However, Francine denied having any romantic relationship with Lanny, and Donna didn't believe it. Donna began documenting Francine's visits. Her diary revealed 2 things. Francine and Lanny's relationship seemed to have gone beyond work, and this was causing her great distress. Gradually, Donna realized that Lanny probably just wanted her to move back in so she could borrow money. Redley watched as his parents' relationship fell apart. He blamed Francine, calling her the woman who destroyed their family. He also believed that his father had an affair with her, noting that his father bought her expensive gifts, paid her bills, and helped her furnish her home. By September 2011, Lanny and Donna's marriage was beyond saving. In early fall, Lanny asked Donna to move out before he left on a business trip with Francine, scheduled for mid-October. He told her that only Francine would accompany him. This devastated Donna. Detectives later concluded that this was when Donna decided Lanny would not leave for that trip. Instead, she allegedly planned his murder. After piecing together the family's tumultuous history, investigators were confident they had identified Lanny's killer. 6 days after the shooting that left Lanny dead from 9 gunshot wounds, his wife Donna was arrested for first-degree murder. Donna hired a lawyer who quickly began defending her. The attorney argued that Donna was a quiet, calm, and shy woman who would be incapable of picking up a gun. She had separated from her husband multiple times before, so it made no sense for her to choose to kill him now. When the police questioned Redley, he expressed deep resentment toward his father. He said the man who had once been kind and cheerful had turned into a nightmare for his family toward the end of his life. According to the defense, while Donna might have had a motive, Redley's motive was much stronger. The defense emphasized that the bathroom was covered in blood. The shooter could not have avoided getting blood on themselves or their clothes. However, Donna was examined during the investigation and found to be completely clean. The case was gaining attention, and public interest was skyrocketing. A major twist comes when Donna's lawyer builds her defense around blaming her son, Radley. In fact, Redley was the most likely culprit. He had at least 500,000 reasons to kill his father. He stood to inherit the life insurance payout, 2 houses, and numerous valuable items. Donna will receive nothing, as she was removed from all inheritance and insurance papers after their first divorce. Redley did inherit a significant fortune, including 2 homes, but he claimed the extent of his wealth was overstated. Both houses needed extensive repairs. He also inherited several cars, but kept only one. In 2011, at the time of the murder, he insisted his finances were in poor shape. He was living with his parents and struggling financially. This was partly because of his time in prison. He had been released about 6 months before his father's death. In the early 2000s, he became a licensed gun dealer, a business his father helped him start. His legal troubles began when he bought an online kit that converted a Glock pistol into a fully automatic weapon. His father had assisted in this illegal purchase, attracting police attention. Although the offense was minor and he wasn't punished, it marked the start of bigger problems. In 2006, Redley was arrested for selling a pistol to a criminal. This time, there was no avoiding consequences. According to Redley, his father showed little sympathy for his legal troubles and even blamed him for causing problems. From that point on, his father constantly insulted and belittled him, complaining that his son was a failure and causing financial stress. Multiple witnesses later confirmed that both Donna and Redley had spoken of Lanny's emotional abuse. Though he never used physical violence, years of emotional mistreatment had taken a toll. Despite all this, prosecutors were convinced Donna was the killer. They studied her every word and movement. They particularly pointed to her refusal to cooperate at the crime scene. Redley, in contrast, fully cooperated, agreeing to DNA testing and gunshot residue tests. When the same requests were made of Donna, she insisted on having a lawyer and refused to comply. Because she had requested a lawyer, she was never even tested for gunshot residue, a major flaw. According to her defense, Donna's lawyer maintained that the prosecution had no solid evidence, only circumstantial claims. Police saw no blood on her pajamas when they arrived, and no fingerprints were found on any of the guns or shell casings, suggesting the shooter wore gloves. No gloves were ever found. Even Donna's diary, though filled with complaints about her husband, contained no signs of homicidal intent. There were many unanswered questions. Donna's attorneys have argued against almost every charge, so the upcoming trial will be tense. Almost a year and a half after the murder, Donna and Redley finally faced each other in court. The media closely followed the trial, as the death of wealthy businessman Lanny Horowitz had become a national story. Many people accused Redley and Francine of helping commit the crime. The legal tactics hurt everyone, but Donna was the one who faced the most criticism, as she was believed to have covered for her son. The defense began by presenting evidence from a luminol test conducted at the Horowitz home. Traces of a glowing substance were found in the bathroom next to Redley's bedroom. The sink in that bathroom lit up under ultraviolet light. However, prosecutors pointed out that all the sinks in the house showed the same reaction. Further testing revealed that the glow was caused not by blood, but by a chemical in a specialized cleaning product used in the home. Early in the trial, the defense also introduced a theory suggesting that someone other than Redley was the killer. The defense attorney claimed the murderer was a hired hitman based on a bloodstain found on the gate of Lanny's house. The stain contained Lanny's blood, as well as DNA from an unidentified person. The DNA did not match Donna, Redley, or anyone in the family or staff. Prosecutors argued the finding was meaningless, since a surface like a gate would likely contain traces from many people who had touched it. According to the prosecution, the home alarm system activated immediately after the first gunshot, which was fired through the bathroom glass. This indicated the killer was already inside the house before the shooting began. If the intruder had forced entry, the alarm would have gone off earlier. When the door or window was opened, the defense countered that the killer might have been allowed inside earlier. which could explain why some surveillance cameras were turned off. They were not meant to record anyone. The defense also claimed that a book about contract killers, purchased by Radley at a gun show shortly before his father's death, pointed to his guilt. However, the prosecutor argued that this theory made little sense. The murder weapon was a revolver that only Donna had. Still, the prosecution asserted that Donna's behavior after the crime suggested her involvement. For instance, unlike Radley, she ran toward the bathroom upon hearing gunfire in the middle of the night. Behavior the prosecution considered suspicious. The idea of a hired killer seemed implausible because Radley was unemployed and financially dependent on his father at the time. When investigators reviewed his finances after he received the life insurance payout, they found no evidence linking him to a paid assassin, which only supported his innocence. When Donna was called to testify and asked to accuse her son directly, she refused. Prosecutors argued that the murder was committed in passionate anger, which aligned with the theory that a furious woman might have acted impulsively after feeling betrayed by Lanny's interest in Francine. Donna fit this description. Radley claimed that his mother had been driven to despair by Francine and eventually snapped, turning to violence. Francine, however, refused to testify because the final shot had been fired into Lanny's own mouth, an act suggesting the attack was intensely personal and fueled by rage. Investigators believed a conflict had taken place before the shooting, though no witnesses could confirm it. After both sides presented their cases, the jury began deliberations. The defense felt confident as the prosecution's case relied solely on circumstantial evidence. There was no direct proof, no DNA, fingerprints, or physical evidence proving Donna's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Nevertheless, the jury returned just 2 hours later with a unanimous verdict. Donna was guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Lanny's relatives and friends, the verdict seemed like justice and brought them relief. They believe Donna is a cold-blooded killer, although she herself continues to deny it. Donna's lawyer appealed her conviction, resulting in a new trial. This time, she was sentenced to 32 years in prison. Reporters continued to pursue the story, interviewing both Donna and her son, Radley. Despite believing his mother had tried to have him imprisoned, Radley stated that he did not want her to go to jail, insisting that she was innocent. 2 years after the tragedy, on what would have been Lanny's 68th birthday, his family and friends gathered on the beach to remember him and let go of any lingering resentment. The case resurfaced in the media, and journalists once again spoke with Radley, who said he had forgiven his mother. Radley explained that he thought about her every day and had visited her several times in prison. Donna Horwitz remains incarcerated at the Lowell County Jail in Florida and is scheduled to be released in 2043. After Lanny Horwitz's murder, his son, Radley, received a $500,000 life insurance policy, $200,000 of which was set aside for Donna. However, Radley disagreed and filed a lawsuit, asking for a portion of her insurance money. Eventually, Donna agreed to give him $90,000, and they made a pact never to speak negatively about each other in public.